The world does not terminate with an explosion. It ends when the eyelids fall. In the immediate cessation of visual stimuli, a profound and immediate pattern interruption occurs. The frantic choreography of the external landscape, the neon architecture of commerce, the racing vehicles, the urgent digital screens demanding ceaseless attention, is instantaneously replaced by a velvety, absolute interior blackness. For the individual who undergoes this deliberate withdrawal, the initial sensation is one of weight. The physical form, previously forgotten in the hyper-reactive pursuit of daily survival, reveals its true relationship with the earth. The skeletal framework sinks deeply into whatever surface supports it, yielding entirely to the invisible, unyielding pull of gravity. Then, out of the silent dark, the involuntary symphony begins. There is a low, resonant sigh as the lungs expand, drawing in oxygen, holding it for a suspended micro-moment of exquisite equilibrium, and releasing it back into the void. This cycle repeats, in, out, in, out. It occurs with an impeccable mathematical precision, yet it is completely decoupled from the human will. Nearby, the rhythmic, heavy thrum of the cardiovascular drum beats out the cadence of existence. Within the hidden chambers of the torso, blood cascades through thousands of miles of microscopic cellular conduits. Liver enzymes dismantle complex molecular structures. Neurological signals fire across synaptic chasms like silent lightning storms within the skull. The conscious mind, which prides itself on being the CEO of its destiny, has absolutely no hand in this masterwork. The individual is not consciously commanding the heart to contract. They are not calculating the pH balance of their blood or manually supervising the mitosis of their dermal layers. The most vital, incredibly complex and foundational operations required to sustain human life are happening at this very moment in a state of absolute, effortless, and trustful surrender. An invisible, profound intelligence runs the vessel. It is operated sleeplessly from the moment of conception, navigating the unfathomable complexities of an organic masterpiece without requiring a single moment of anxious intervention, monitoring, or control from the ego. It does not bargain. It does not struggle. It simply is. Yet, the moment the eyelids lift and the external world rushes back into the pupils, an immediate and devastating paradox takes hold. The individual stands up from their chair, clenches their jaw, and immediately assumes that navigating their external desires, the acquisition of wealth, the cultivation of a profound relationship, the mending of a fractured biological system, or the alteration of a difficult circumstance requires a state of violent, exhausting, and unremitting mental warfare. The supreme irony of the human condition is thus laid bare. Humanity possesses absolute faith in the silent intelligence that constructs its eyes, yet harbors total, panicked distrust in that same intelligence to direct where those eyes look. To understand why this psychological schism exists, consciousness must turn its analytical lens inward and deploy a rigorous method of recursive thinking. One must look past the superficial symptoms of human stress and demand to know the fundamental why behind this addiction to friction. Why does an individual who relies entirely on an effortless internal system for their very breath simultaneously believe that their external life must be wrestled into existence through a state of perpetual agony? The answer lies buried deep within the ancestral architecture of the human ego. For millennia, the physical senses have reported a profound lie, the illusion of absolute separation. The eye beholds an object, a sum of currency, a distant lover, a position of authority, and classifies it as out there. Because the object is perceived as separate from the self, the primitive mind concludes that the only mechanism available to bridge the gap between the observer and the observed is physical and psychological force. The ego equates survival with effort. To the unawakened consciousness, to cease striving is to invite death. But how does this internal panic actually operate within the creative matrix of reality? It operates through a total misunderstanding of the cosmic mechanics. Reality is not an independent concrete fortress that must be besieged and conquered. It is a fluid, uncompromising mirror. When an individual approaches the mirror of life with a state of urgency, desperation, and grinding determination, they are not merely working hard, they are emitting a specific, powerful frequency of consciousness. Underneath the frantic visualization practiced with clenched jaws, underneath the desperate affirmations muttered through gritted teeth, lies a structural, fully operative assumption: the desire is currently absent. The universe, acting as a flawless and unblinking mirror, does not respond to the superficial words or actions performed by the individual. It cares nothing for the theatrical display of hard work or the performance of spiritual piety. The mirror merely reflects the exact contours of the internal state. If the dominant internal state is an assumption of lack of belief that the goal is missing and must be hunted down, the mirror must faithfully, precisely, and without mercy project back an environment of scarcity, prolonged delays, and insurmountable obstacles. The individual is caught in a tragic loop. They fight because they perceive absence, and their very fighting ensures that absence remains the dominant reality of their life. This is the illusion of fighting the shadow. If a man wishes to change the silhouette cast upon a wall, he does not assault the dark shape with his fists. He does not try to scrape the shadow off the plaster or scream at it to alter its form. He recognizes that the shadow is merely an immutable echo of the form standing before the light. To change the shadow, he must change the posture of the object casting it. Similarly, external circumstances are nothing more than the physical projections of the internal state. Attempting to force a change in the physical world through sheer manual labor while maintaining an internal state of anxiety is the equivalent of trying to manually alter a broadcast by manipulating the glass screen of a television. Sit. The individual must leave the screen alone and alter the radio dial within. In the ancient misty valley of Oakhaven, isolated from the rest of civilization by a ring of jagged sapphire-tinted mountains, lay the kingdom of the Grand Weavers. For generations, the citizens of this realm were bound to a singular, sacred task: the creation of the great tapestry of fate. This monumental textile, miles in length and breathtaking in its complexity, was said to dictate the harmony, weather, and prosperity of the entire valley. The weavers of Oakhaven were taught from infancy that the tapestry demanded total, agonizing human sacrifice. The traditional method of production was brutal. Hundreds of weavers sat before colossal wooden frames, manually pulling thick, coarse threads through the warp and weft. To ensure the density of the pattern, they were required to pull the lines with a white-knuckled intensity. Over decades, their fingers became permanently deformed, split by friction and calloused by unyielding labor. The air in the grand halls was thick with dust and the sounds of groaning wood, weeping workers, and the rhythmic, violent thud-thud-thud of the heavy wooden beams being slammed into place by sheer muscle power. The weavers believed that if they did not push themselves to the absolute brink of physical collapse, if they did not grit their teeth and suffer for every square inch of fabric, the tapestry would unravel and the valley would descend into famine and darkness. They viewed their bleeding hands as badges of honor, proof of their seriousness and devotion. Hardship was the official religion of Oakhaven. Among them was a young weaver named Kalen. Unlike his peers, Kalen spent his rare hours of rest not in a state of exhausted stupor, but sitting by the edge of the great river that roared through the lowlands of the valley. He observed the water, how it carved through solid granite, not by wielding a hammer, but by flowing consistently, effortlessly, adapting to every contour of the stone without a single moment of panic or strain. One evening, deep within the subterranean vaults beneath the palace where the oldest parts of the tapestry were anchored, Kalen made a staggering discovery. Hidden behind a massive wall of ivy and forgotten stones lay an ancient, monumental iron mechanism. It was a subterranean loom, immense in scale, its gears cast from ancient metals that defied time. As Kalen cleared away the debris of centuries, he gasped. The core axle of this magnificent loom did not terminate in a handle for human hands. Instead, it extended out through a carved stone portal directly into the heart of the subterranean river. The ancient engineers had not designed the tapestry to be woven by human agony. They had built a masterpiece of absolute automation. The moment Kalen released the rusted locking lever, the immense weight of the river's natural current caught the external water wheel. Deep within the vault, the gears began to turn. The movement was breathtakingly silent. Massive shuttles of gold and silver slid through the air with a fluid, frictionless grace, weaving a textile infinitely tighter, more vibrant, and more complex than anything human hands had ever produced. The next morning, Kalen brought the High Council of Weavers down into the dark vault. He showed them the massive iron wheels spinning without friction, the threads organizing themselves into complex geometries under the propulsion of the river's involuntary current. "Look," Kalen whispered, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "For 300 years, we have broken our bones and bloodied our fingers to force the tapestry into existence. We believed our struggle was the fuel that kept the pattern alive. But our struggle was merely an interruption. The river was always here, ready to weave the destiny of our kingdom with a perfection we could never hope to mimic. We did not need to fight the loom. We only needed to let the current turn the wheel." The older weavers looked at their scarred hands, then at the flawless, effortless beauty of the automated cloth emerging from the dark. They realized that their centuries of torment were not a prerequisite for creation, but a monument to their own profound ignorance. The narrative of the ancient weavers is not a fairy tale. It is the exact structural biography of modern human consciousness. To transition from the agonizing labor of the manual loom to the effortless precision of the river-driven wheel, the individual must learn the art of practical somatic and psychological integration. This shift cannot remain an intellectual concept. It must be anchored into the flesh today. To embody this truth, the individual must practice the discipline of the sovereign anchor. Whenever the mind detects the onset of urgency, the tightening of the chest, the shallowing of the breath, the mental loop that whispers that a deadline must be met with panic, the individual must immediately execute an internal halt. They must consciously drop their shoulders, release the tension held within the deep muscles of the jaw, and allow the abdomen to soften completely. In this state of physical release, they must pose a singular, devastating question to their own consciousness. How would the body feel right now if the desire were already an accomplished historical fact? This question is not designed to trigger a frantic visualization or a forced emotional performance. It is designed to locate a specific, grounded quality of inner silence. It is the feeling of a closed case. It is the simple, almost ordinary certainty of an individual who knows their own name, or who knows that the sun will rise tomorrow morning without their assistance. When this state of inner acceptance is achieved, the individual must step into the world not as someone trying to achieve a victory, but as someone who is executing a victory that has already occurred. The walk slows, the voice deepens, the frantic urgency vanishes from the eyes. They become magnetic to the reality they have claimed, for they are no longer broadcasting the frequency of pursuit, they are radiating the frequency of possession. But as the individual begins to experiment with this profound peace, as they begin to let the river of consciousness weave the tapestry of their life, a deeper, darker shadow emerges on the horizon of the mind. The old conditioning of the world will not surrender its territory without a final, desperate psychological gambit. The mind, long trained in the temples of hardship, will begin to look around the silent inner vault and whisper a terrifying objection. Who gave you permission to be free? Who is keeping track of your labor? If you do not suffer, how will the master of the house know you have earned your bread? The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now shift from the mechanics of the loom to the great courtroom of the human spirit. For deep within the subconscious architecture of every individual sits a terrifying phantom, a cold, calculating entity that has monitored humanity's desires since the dawn of time, demanding an accounting for every ounce of joy. To break the final chains of struggle, one must dare to enter the grand, celestial office of this phantom and expose the profound lie of its authority. The journey must now confront the ancient, terrifying illusion of the cosmic ledger and dismantle forever the myth of the celestial auditor. The architecture of human anxiety is nowhere more visible than in the vast imaginary purgatory of the transactional mind. If one could peel back the skull of the average seeker and look upon the landscape of their spiritual ambition, they would behold an infinite, sterile corporate labyrinth. This is a realm constructed of monochromatic stone, cold limestone corridors, stretching into an unlit eternity, lit only by the harsh, flickering glare of an absolute evaluation. Here, millions of human souls stand before massive, iron-bound ledgers. They do not rest. They do not breathe with the involuntary grace of the living vessel. Instead, they pace frantically, counting their prayers, logging their hours of visualization, and weighing their moments of emotional high fidelity like desperate laborers checking a punch card at the end of an exhausting shift. In this grim landscape, the practices of transformation have been weaponized into tools of manual labor. Look closely at the figures inhabiting the halls. Their jaws are locked with a white-knuckle intensity. Their eyes are bloodshot, strained from the effort of holding an image within their minds by sheer force of muscle. They visualize through gritted teeth, as if the object of their desire were a weight that must be lifted by the brute strength of the frontal lobe. They chant their affirmations like assembly line workers repeating a mechanical movement, terrified that if they miss a single repetition, if their attention drifts for a fractional second, the entire production line will halt. They perform their gratitude not as an overflow of systemic peace, but as a tax payment to a volatile landlord. They offer up their joy as though it were being graded by a celestial auditor, an invisible, hypercritical bureaucrat who sits behind a high desk, checking the quality of their feelings, measuring the sincerity of their vibration, and deciding whether they have finally suffered enough to qualify for a delivery of basic happiness. The atmosphere is thick with the suffocating energy of a performance review. Every spiritual technique is executed from a posture of profound defense, driven by a low-grade, rhythmic panic that whispers, "You are being watched, you are being measured, you are currently failing to meet the standard." The supreme tragedy of this performance is that the individuals trapped within it wonder why the path feels like swimming upstream against an angry torrent. They do not realize that the very intensity of their labor is the documentation of their bankruptcy. They have turned the infinite field of potential into a cosmic employer, a cruel, withholding master who demands a specific quota of human agony before releasing a single coin of reward. To dismantle this transactional paradigm, consciousness must execute a ruthless interrogation of its own hidden structures. One must deploy the method of recursive thinking, peeling back the layer of superficial effort to ask the foundational question. Why does the human mind instinctively construct a courthouse between itself and its fulfillment? The why is rooted in the ego's deep-seated trauma of unworthiness. From the moment an individual enters the cultural matrix, they are conditioned to believe that life is an ongoing negotiation with scarcity. They are taught that everything of value must be earned through the currency of struggle, that comfort without sweat is suspicious, that delight without prior torment is an illegitimate inheritance. When this social conditioning is projected onto the spiritual plane, it creates the archetype of the celestial auditor. The human mind needs a judge because it cannot accept the terrifying simplicity of an unconditional reality. To accept that fulfillment requires no manual labor is to strip the ego of its favorite weapon, its self-righteous pride in its own suffering. How then does this psychological courthouse actively sabotage the mechanics of manifestation? It operates through a total subversion of the radio dial of consciousness. Every state of consciousness operates at a distinct frequency. The frequency of having a thing is characterized by a quiet, unbothered stability, an unhurried ease that takes the presence of the object for granted. The frequency of seeking a thing, however, is a chaotic, high-velocity vibration driven by the acute awareness of lack. When an individual approaches a practice with white-knuckled intensity, they are tuning the internal radio dial directly to the frequency of absolute destitution. The harder they strive to impress the auditor, the louder they announce their own poverty. Consider the law of the mirror. The universal consciousness does not possess an analytical mind. It has no opinion, no moral code, and no discretionary power. It is an unblinking cinematic mirror that can only reflect the dominant underlying assumption of the observer. When a person visualizes with clenched teeth, the mirror does not see the beautiful home or the healed body they are imagining. The mirror registers only the clenched teeth. It detects the strain, the panic, the desperation of the fighter. Because the structural assumption behind the fight is that the prize is currently missing, the mirror is bound by its own nature to reflect an external reality where the prize remains perpetually out of reach, retreating like a horizon line as the traveler walks toward it. The performance of gratitude from a place of need is another manifestation of this trap. It is the deployment of an echo to drown out a scream. The individual shouts, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," in the hope that the universe will hear the words and overlook the fact that their stomach is knotted with fear. But consciousness cannot be deceived by vocabulary. It does not hear the echo of the words. It hears the silence of the fear beneath them. The transactional paradigm is an absolute failure because it attempts to use the energy of a beggar to buy the kingdom of a monarch. As long as the individual treats their desire as a wage to be earned from a cosmic employer, they remain a servant waiting in the courtyard, locked out of the estate by the very ledgers they have written with their own hands. In the eastern provinces of the old empire, beneath the shadow of the jagged obsidian crags, lay the great quarry of Oros. For 50 years, a laborer named Jaron spent his days within the suffocating dust of the deep pits. His hands were leathered, his knuckles permanently swollen from the weight of the heavy iron sledgehammer he swung from dawn until dusk. His skin was parched by the salt winds, and his back was bent into the permanent curve of a man who had never looked at the stars without a weight upon his neck. Jaron was consumed by a singular burning fixation, the sunlit manor. The manor was a breathtaking estate that sat upon the highest green ridge above the quarry. Its walls were carved from smooth, cream-colored marble that seemed to catch the light of the sun long after it had set on the lowlands. Its terraced gardens flowed with sweet water, and its high windows looked out over the entire world with a serene, unbothered majesty. To Jaron, the manor was the ultimate symbol of redemption. He believed with every fiber of his being that if he could only accumulate enough gold to purchase the deeds to that house, his life of agony would be justified, and his worth as a man would be sealed forever. The law of the empire was unyielding. The estate could only be purchased through the presentation of ancient imperial gold coins, which could only be earned by extracting the rarest, deepest veins of obsidian from the dangerous lower galleries of the pit. For 5 decades, Jaron lived like an ascetic monk. He slept on the hard earth. He ate nothing but stale barley bread and thin water. He ran his body through an unremitting regime of labor that claimed the lives of hundreds of his peers. Whenever his muscles screamed for rest, whenever his spirit threatened to break, he would look up at the marble walls on the ridge, clench his jaw, and strike the stone harder. He became a legend in the quarry, a man of white-knuckled discipline who never smiled, never lingered, and performed his work with the frantic intensity of a prisoner bargaining for his execution date. He kept his own secret ledger, scratching a mark into a flat stone for every basket of obsidian he delivered, constantly calculating how much closer he was to satisfying the demands of the imperial overseer. On the morning of his 71st year, Jaron looked at his stone ledger and realized the tally was finally complete. He had accumulated the exact sum required by the law. His body was a ruined temple, his lungs whistled with dust, his knees ground together with arthritic fire, and his eyes were half blinded by the dark of the pits. But as he dragged his heavy leather sack of gold up the winding road to the sunlit manor, his heart swelled with a fierce, triumphant pride. He had earned his rest. He had paid the price in full. He reached the grand iron gates of the estate, where an elderly, white-haired archivist sat behind a desk of polished walnut, surrounded by the imperial tax scrolls. Jaron dumped his sack of gold onto the wood with a heavy metallic crash. "I have come for the deed to the sunlit manor," Jaron rasped, his voice sounding like dry stone sliding down a hill. "Here is the gold. 50 years of blood, sweat, and stone. Count it. Every piece is earned." The archivist did not count the gold. He looked at Jaron's deformed hands, his scarred face, and his ruined posture with a look of profound, sorrowful pity. The old man reached into a deep cedar drawer beneath the desk and pulled out a long, cylindrical ivory case. He unrolled an ancient vellum scroll, its edges gilded with silver leaf, and laid it flat over the pile of coins. "Jaron," the archivist said softly, "you have no need of this gold. Look at the seal at the base of this parchment." Jaron leaned forward, his clouded eyes straining to read the elegant imperial script. At the bottom of the deed, stamped in the dark red wax of the emperor's personal signet, was his own family name. The document had been signed 70 years ago, on the night of Jaron's birth. His father had been a high commander of the imperial guard, and upon his death the emperor had deeded the sunlit manor to Jaron as an absolute, unconditioned inheritance. The house had belonged to him before he had ever learned to hold a hammer. A vast, heavy silence descends upon the high ridge, broken only by the wind moving through the terraced gardens. In this stillness, as the weight of 50 years of useless torment begins to dawn upon the soul, the listener is invited to step outside the frantic labor of their own mind. Subscribing to this manuscript is the act of dropping the sledgehammer, an alignment that ensures the remaining maps of freedom are delivered to your door without the requirement of your agony. Jaron stared at the parchment, his breath caught in his throat. If the house was mine, he whispered, why did the overseers let me work in the pits? Why did they let me break my body for the gold? The overseers did not force you into the pits, Jaron, the archivist replied with a heavy sigh. They merely bought the stone you insisted on digging. You never came to the archive to ask what was written in the book of your inheritance. You assumed you were a slave, and because you assumed it, you lived as one. Your 50 years of labor did not buy this manor. It only kept you too exhausted to live within its walls. The tragedy of the old miner is the daily biography of the frantic seeker. To transition from the exhaustion of the quarry to the sovereign peace of the inheritance, the individual must learn to draft their own immediate psychological resignation letter to the celestial auditor. The transactional paradigm must be dissolved not by completing the ledger, but by ripping the pages out of the book. To anchor this transformation into the immediate present, the individual must implement the practice of the inheritance audit. Once per day, at the moment when the mind is most gripped by the urgency of a specific desire, whether it be the resolution of a financial crisis, the appearance of a partner, or the healing of a biological system, the individual must sit quietly and visualize their desire not as a target on a distant horizon, but as an ancient asset currently held in a secure vault under their own name. They must look at the mental image of their goal and say to themselves with an absolute internal finality, this cannot be bought with my struggle, for its price exceeds the value of human agony. It can only be claimed as an inheritance that was signed before my first breath. This mental shift instantly alters the posture of the nervous system. The individual drops the time card of the spiritual sweatshop. They stop treating their meditation or their focus as an interrogation under a spotlight. Instead, they allow their awareness to rest in the quiet, spacious certainty of an heir who is simply waiting for the legal processing of an estate they already own. They step into the world with the unhurried, grounded walk of a person who has no one to impress, nothing to prove, and no celestial debt to pay. They leave the auditor's office forever, shutting the heavy iron doors behind them. But as the ledger closes, as the mind begins to taste the first sweet draughts of an unearned peace, a new and more insidious pattern interruption begins to form in the deep corridors of consciousness. The absolute stillness of the inheritance reveals a sudden, shocking view of the landscape outside. The individual looks out through the windows of the sunlit manor and notices a strange phenomenon. The traveler who was running across the desert in the distance has not slowed down. In fact, the faster he runs, the more the entire desert appears to stretch, expand, and warp around his strides. A chilling realization begins to dawn upon the observer. The runner is not moving across an independent geography. The geography itself is moving in response to his running. To understand why the world behaves in this elastic, terrifying manner, the lens of our inquiry must now leave the courthouse behind and venture out into the shifting sands of the void. We must prepare to study the precise mathematical mechanics of distance and look directly into the terrifying creative engine known as the blueprint of absence. The white expanse of the salt desert offers no landmarks, no orientation, and no mercy. Under the blinding, incandescent glare of a sun that seems fixed at the absolute zenith of the heavens, a lone traveler is captured in a state of frantic, uninterrupted motion. The ground beneath his feet is a cracked, crystalline mosaic of bleached earth, radiating an intense, undulating heat shimmer that distorts the very geometry of the horizon. His throat is a parched cavern. His breath escapes his lips in short, ragged gasps that are instantly swallowed by the vast, silent vacuum of the wasteland. His eyes, inflamed by the salt glare, are locked with an absolute, monomaniacal intensity upon a singular point in the distance, a magnificent, shimmering oasis of crystalline water and emerald palms that hovers on the edge of his vision. Driven by an overpowering primal terror of deletion, the traveler accelerates. He throws the entire kinetic weight of his biological system into the pursuit. He sprints, his boots shattering the fragile salt crust, his chest heaving against the heavy, stagnant air. Yet, as his velocity increases, a terrifying mathematical paradox reveals itself. The faster his legs move, the faster the oasis appears to glide away from him. When he stops to draw a desperate breath, the emerald towers stand perfectly still, maintaining an agonizing, unbridgeable distance. When he lunges forward in a desperate, white-knuckled burst of speed, the horizon recedes in perfect, fluid synchronization, matching his momentum yard for yard, mile for mile. The geometry of the chase is flawless and unyielding. The traveler does not realize that he is trapped within an optical and metaphysical loop. He believes he is navigating an independent landscape, trying to bridge a physical gap between his empty hands and a distant source of salvation. He cannot see the invisible thread that binds his own panic to the behavior of the horizon. He is operating under the absolute conviction that urgency is his only savior, that if he does not run with a desperate, self-consuming intensity, he will perish in the waste. This is the cinematic nightmare of human ambition, the pursuit of a destination that uses the traveler's own velocity as the engine of its retreat. The individual runs toward wealth, toward healing, toward validation, completely blind to the fact that the very act of their running is the energetic decree that keeps the prize cast out on the distant edge of tomorrow. To uncover the hidden engine of this metaphysical trap, consciousness must deploy the incisive weapon of recursive thinking, boring through the outer theater of human effort to examine the structural foundations of urgency. One must halt the runner in his tracks and demand an answer to the most critical, internal questions. Why does the human psyche instinctively accelerate its pace when it perceives a profound desire, and how does this acceleration dictate the behavior of reality? The why is born from a deep structural flaw within the unawakened ego, the foundational belief that reality is a historical chronicle written by physical actions alone. The ego perceives an absence in the immediate environment, an empty bank ledger, a silent room, an aching joint, and translates this sensory data into an emergency. It assumes that because the desire is not currently visible to the eyes, it does not exist within the universe. Therefore, the ego concludes that it must step into the role of a creator, using the blunt instruments of panic, strategic manipulation, and exhausting manual labor to force the non-existent thing into the physical realm. Urgency is the ego's confession of absolute poverty. It is the frantic declaration that the soul is currently empty. How, then, does this internal state of emergency govern the external landscape? It operates through the immutable laws of the mirror of consciousness. Consciousness is the only creative substance in the cosmos. It does not create from the superficial concepts held in the intellect, but from the deep, honest, structural assumptions held within the core of the self. When an individual pursues an object with desperate, grinding energy, the underlying assumption, the true, active broadcast of their being, is that the object is entirely absent. Every anxious visualization, every frantic affirmation muttered like a magic spell to escape a crisis is a loud, unyielding broadcast that screams, "I do not have this thing." The mirror of reality, operating without judgment, sentimentality, or mercy, cannot reflect what the individual wants. It can only reflect what the individual is currently assuming to be true. When the mirror registers an internal state of desperate pursuit, it faithfully and precisely reproduces the physical equivalent of that pursuit. It creates an external world of prolonged distances, unexpected blockages, and retreating horizons. The individual who strives with urgency is attempting to change the station on the radio dial of existence by smashing the speakers. They are turning the dial deeper into the frequency of wanting, wondering all the while why the music of having refuses to play. This is the ultimate delusion of fighting the shadow. The seeker treats their external circumstances as an enemy to be conquered through manual effort. They fight the shadow of poverty by working 20 hours a day with a bitter, terrified heart. They fight the shadow of loneliness by chasing after individuals who do not see them. They do not realize that the shadow cannot change its shape until the form casting it undergoes an internal rearrangement. To run after a desire from a place of lack is to ensure its flight. The blueprint of absence is written by the hand of the pursuer. The very intensity of the chase is the documentation of the void. In the high, desolate regions of the northern steppes, perched upon a knife-edge cliff of gray granite, sat the fortress city of Kael Gora. The city was ruled by an aging monarch, King Malachor, a sovereign whose early reign had been marked by a catastrophic famine that nearly wiped his lineage from the earth. Though the storehouses of Kael Gora were now bursting with grain, and its deep vaults were packed to the rafters with bars of solid, unblemished bullion, the ancient trauma remained carved into the very marrow of the king's psyche. Malachor lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade emergency. He looked upon his vast wealth not with the relaxed confidence of a ruler, but with the paranoid intensity of a thief who feared the morning light. To combat his silent, midnight terrors of ruin, the king commissioned the construction of the Hall of Proclamation. This immense chamber was built directly over the Valley of the Rebound, a colossal, subterranean limestone chasm that dropped 5 miles into the dark of the earth, famed for its extraordinary, unnatural acoustic properties. Every morning at dawn, Malachor would walk out onto a narrow stone tongue that projected over the absolute blackness of the chasm. He would clench his fists, lock his jaw, and use the full power of his lungs to shout declarations of his security into the void. "I am the master of gold," the king would scream, his face turning crimson with the physical effort of his proclamation. "My kingdom is secure. Scarcity is banished from these walls. I am wealthy, unassailable, and filled with abundance." He did not shout from an overflow of peace. He shouted to drown out the quiet, cold voice in his stomach that whispered he was one bad harvest away from starvation. He threw his words into the chasm with the frantic energy of a man throwing stones at an advancing army. He monitored his voice, trying to make it sound as authoritative, heavy, and convincing as possible, performing his strength as if he were being graded by the stone walls themselves. But the physics of the Valley of the Rebound were absolute and without pity. The chasm did not register the dictionary definitions of the words thrown into its belly. It was an unblinking, mechanical ear that returned only the exact acoustic, emotional frequency of the sound waves that struck its limestone walls. When Malachor's voice hit the cold stone, the chasm stripped away the semantic illusion of his words. It caught the underlying panic, the desperation, the frantic resonance of his fear of lack. A few seconds after each shout, the void would open its mouth and return the echo. The sound that cascaded back up into the Hall of Proclamation was terrifying. It was the king's own voice, amplified 1,000 times by the geometry of the deep earth, but it returned as a hollow, ghostly, mocking roar of pure distress. The words came back distorted, sounding to the king's paranoid ears like, "Gold is a phantom, security is an illusion, lack is at the gate." The harder the king shouted, the more violent, chaotic, and terrifying the echo became. He spent his days in an exhausting war with his own resonance, screaming himself hoarse to conquer the terrifying sounds returning from the dark, never realizing that the canyon was merely a flawless mirror throwing back the exact frequency of the panic that initiated the shout. A natural pause emerges within the vast canyon walls as the mocking echo of the king's voice slowly dissolves into the cold, ancient silence of the deep stone. In this space of profound stillness, as the futility of human screaming becomes clear, the soul is offered a choice to cease its warfare. Subscribing to this ongoing manuscript is the act of silencing the frantic shout, an intentional step that ensures your consciousness is gently guided out of the canyon of echoes and into the serene chambers of self-contained sovereignty. King Malachor eventually collapsed on the stone tongue, his vocal cords ruptured, his body trembling with an absolute exhaustion. He had spent his life using the energy of a beggar to proclaim the kingdom of a monarch, and the canyon had faithfully delivered nothing but the resonance of his own poverty. The madness of King Malachor is the precise architectural blueprint of the individual who attempts to force reality into compliance through the urgent acceleration of their thoughts and actions. To step off the accelerating treadmill of lack and dissolve the blueprint of absence, the individual must implement the practice of the zero-velocity anchor. This is the immediate conscious cessation of the psychological chase, executed not when life is peaceful, but precisely when the sensory world reports a crisis. To embody this truth today, the individual must learn to recognize the somatic signature of chasing. The moment they detect themselves checking a device with a tight stomach, imagining a future conversation with an anxious loop, or treating a daily task as a frantic bridge to a better tomorrow, they must anchor their physical form into absolute immobility. They must freeze their movement for 60 seconds. In this deliberate stillness, they must withdraw their attention from the external screen of life and turn the radio dial inward, away from the station of seeking and directly into the absolute silence of the end. In this space of non-action, they must completely abandon the attempt to fix, alter, or manipulate their circumstances. They must treat their current physical lack not as an emergency to be solved, but as a harmless shadow, a dying echo of an old internal state that has already run its course. They look at the absence and say to themselves with a quiet, unbothered authority, "I refuse to run after that which is already cast in stone, for my running only confirms its distance. I stand still, and I allow the universe to collapse the space between my heart and its home." As this somatic release occurs, the breath deepens naturally, the shoulders drop, and the frantic urgency leaves the eyes. The individual steps back into their day, moving with an unhurried, majestic gait, refusing to let the illusions of time and space dictate their internal posture. They have dropped the tools of the hunter. They have ceased to be a pursuer. But as the individual masters this initial immobility, as they learn to stand perfectly still amidst the shifting sands of the world, a new and deeper mystery begins to unfold within their awareness. The absolute cessation of their running does not leave them empty. Instead, as the dust of their frantic movement settles, they notice a strange, heavy, and immense presence gathering in the center of their silence. It is a quality of immobility so profound that it begins to exert its own gravitational pull on the surrounding environment. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now leave the desert entirely and plunge deep into the unbothered depths of the great void. We must prepare to study the nature of an authority that requires no external weapons to defend its territory, and step across the threshold into the immense, unbreakable sanctuary known as the sovereign stillness. The surface of the North Atlantic during a winter equinox is a theater of absolute cataclysmic violence. Screaming gales, born in the frozen voids of the Arctic, whip the ocean into an emerald fury. Monolithic walls of water, crested with jagged white foam, smash into one another with the kinetic force of colliding continents. Here, atmospheric pressure plunges into a steep, chaotic vortex, fracturing steel hulls and scattering the frantic distress signals of ships caught in the churn. To any observer marooned on this shifting landscape, reality appears to be an unremitting crisis, a frantic, loud, and unstable battle for survival where any cessation of defensive maneuver leads to immediate destruction. The air is saturated with freezing spray, the sky is a bruised canvas of low-hanging dark clouds, and the sensory apparatus is utterly overwhelmed by the relentless roar of displacement. Yet, if the cinematic lens dissolves through this boiling surface, descending 50 feet, 500 feet, 5 miles down into the abyssal plains of the ocean floor, a striking paradox is encountered. At the bottom of the world, within the absolute dark of the Hadal zone, lies an unbreakable, unbothered stillness. Here the water pressure does not fluctuate by a single millibar. It is immense, uniform, and monolithic, exerting a weight that would instantly flatten an iron vault. Yet, this unfathomable pressure does not produce chaos or destruction. Instead, it creates a state of perfect, crystalline stability. The frantic storms raging 5 miles above do not exist here. The screaming winds cannot send a single vibration into this ancient sanctuary. The abyss does not fight the pressure. It does not brace against the weight of the ocean, nor does it perform elaborate defense mechanisms to maintain its peace. It simply inhabits its own density. It rests in a quiet, immovable composure, so profound that it dictates the thermal regulation of the entire planet from the absolute dark. This is the great metaphysical architecture of the sovereign stillness. The human mind, caught in the cultural typhoons of modern life, looks upon the surface storm of its circumstances, the bills to be paid, the bodily symptoms to be cured, the fractured relationships to be mended, and concludes that peace is a luxury that can only be attained once the storm has ceased. The individual believes that relaxation is a passive state of vulnerability, a dangerous lowering of the shields that invites deletion. They do not realize that true spiritual relaxation is not the absence of pressure, but the discovery of an internal depth so immense that no surface storm can ever alter its coordinate on the map of reality. To rescue the concept of relaxation from the degradation of modern definition, consciousness must direct its gaze into the deep psychological anatomy of human inaction. We must deploy the method of recursive thinking, boring through the superficial layers of societal conditioning to ask the foundational question: why does the human ego instinctively view ease with deep suspicion, and how does a state of absolute inner immobility exert a creative gravity over the material world? The why is rooted in the collective addiction to struggle as a metric of identity. Since the dawn of the industrial consciousness, humanity has been systematically trained to equate its worth with its friction. The ego whispers that a result achieved without suffering is illegitimate, that if an individual is not perpetually braced, anxious, and monitoring their reality, they are being profoundly irresponsible. When a person is told to relax into their assumption of fulfillment, a defensive mechanism instantly rises up within the psyche. It screams that relaxation is the equivalent of surrender, the lazy apathy of a defeated soul who has given up on their dreams. The mind mistakes the slack-jawed indifference of exhaustion for the sovereign stillness of mastery, unable to comprehend that they are looking at opposite poles of the universe. How, then, does true relaxation operate as the ultimate expression of spiritual authority? It operates through the absolute stabilization of the radio dial of consciousness. Slack-jawed indifference is the frequency of a broken receiver. It is the dull numbness of a soul that believes nothing matters and that they have no power over the broadcast. Sovereign stillness, conversely, is the quiet, almost boring immobility of an individual who knows a fact so completely that they no longer require external signs to defend it. If a woman is handed a legal document proving she owns an international bank vault, she does not stand outside the stone walls every morning shouting at the guards or pounding her fists against the iron gates to prove her claim. She does not pace her bedroom floor with a knotted stomach, wondering if the vault will disappear if she stops thinking about it. She goes about her days with a quiet, unhurried composure. Her relaxation is not a sign that she does not care about the gold. It is the ultimate, definitive proof that she knows the gold is already hers. Let us trace this principle through the law of the mirror. When an individual operates from a state of frantic effort, they are constantly adjusting their posture before the glass, trying to manually reshape the reflection. They visualize with intensity, then run to the window to see if reality has changed. They affirm with desperation, then check their bank balance 5 minutes later to see if the words took effect. This hyperactivity reports to the mirror that the individual is still standing in the cold, looking in from the outside. The mirror, bound by its own structural mechanics, must continue to project back an environment of exclusion. When the individual adopts the sovereign stillness, they freeze their posture in the identity of fulfillment. They turn the internal radio dial to the exact frequency of absolute completion and lock the mechanism in place. They refuse to let the surface waves of contrary evidence alter their internal position. They understand that the external world is nothing more than a delayed echo, a harmless shadow cast by an old state of consciousness. By remaining completely unmoved in their internal knowing, they force the mirror to break its old patterns. The material world, lacking any independent creative power of its own, has no choice but to slow down, turn around, and reorganize its entire scenery to match the unshakable density of the observer. In the historical chronicles of the old empire, during the golden era of the Muromachi shogunate, there stood an ancient temple known as the Sanctuary of the Clouded Mirror, hidden deep within the cedar forests of Mount Hiei. The temple was home to Master Takuan, an elderly, unpretentious monk who was whispered to be the greatest, most lethal duelist in the history of the realm, though no living man had ever seen him draw his blade in anger. One spring morning, a notorious challenger named Ren arrived at the temple gates. Ren was a swordsman of hyperkinetic genius, a master of 1,000 intricate techniques whose movements were so blindingly fast that he was said to cut the wings off a fly mid-flight. He was a man of intense white-knuckled discipline, his body a tight wire of muscle, his jaw perpetually set in a grim line of absolute focus. He had spent his life grinding his way through every fencing academy in the capital, defeating his opponents through the sheer, aggressive velocity of his assault and the terrifying intensity of his presence. Ren stepped onto the polished wooden veranda of the temple, his hand resting on the hilt of his forged steel katana. Master Takuan walked out to meet him, wearing nothing but a faded hemp robe, carrying a simple wooden practice sword slung loosely by his side. The duel began. Ren immediately dropped into a low, predatory stance, his muscles coiled like iron springs. He began to move in a fluid, rapid circle around the old monk, his feet executing a flawless, rhythmic dance of misdirection. He flashed his blade in short, blinding arcs, creating a sensory storm of steel and shadow, designed to overwhelm Taquan's perception. Ren's eyes were wide, burning with the frantic intensity of a man who needed to dominate the moment, his breath coming in sharp, disciplined, aggressive bursts through his gritted teeth. Master Taquan did not adopt a defensive posture. He did not coil his muscles, nor did he mirror the rapid movements of his opponent. He stood completely ordinary and almost boringly still in the center of the veranda. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his shoulders were dropped in a state of total biological relaxation. His eyes were soft, looking not at Ren's blade, but through the challenger, as if gazing at a distant mountain range. He looked less like a warrior engaged in a mortal contest and more like an old man enjoying the morning air. Ren, infuriated by this apparent display of indifference, lunged forward with a terrifying roar. He executed his master technique, a multi-directional, cascading strike that attacked 5 lethal points of the body simultaneously. The air whistled with the velocity of his steel. But as Ren entered the immediate space surrounding the old monk, a strange and terrifying psychological phenomenon occurred. The absolute unmoving stillness of Taquan acted like a massive unseen gravitational well. Because Taquan did not react, because he did not offer a single molecule of resistance or friction for Ren to calibrate against, Ren's hyper-reactive mind suddenly lost its orientation. The challenger felt as though he were swinging his sword into an infinite, bottomless abyss. The frantic intensity of his own movement, finding no echo in the opponent, turned inward, unbalancing his own center of gravity. At the absolute fraction of a second before the steel could touch the hemp robe, Taquan made a single, unhurried adjustment. Without any appearance of hurry, without any white-knuckled strain, he slid his foot back 3 inches and allowed the wooden sword to drop via the simple force of gravity onto Ren's exposed wrist. The impact was definitive. Ren's steel katana clattered onto the wooden deck. The young challenger fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Master Taquan remained perfectly calm, his breath deep, slow, and rhythmic, his posture entirely unbothered. "Your technique is a masterpiece of speed, young warrior," Taquan said softly, sheathing his wooden blade with a fluid, relaxed movement. "But you are fighting the shadow of your opponent. You believe that to win, you must move faster than the storm. I have learned that the center of the storm is entirely motionless. My stillness did not defeat your sword. Your own frantic energy, finding no anchor in me, shattered your structure from within. You have spent your life training your muscles to fight, but you have never trained your spirit to rest in its own victory. The defeat of the frantic swordsman provides the exact operational manual for the individual who wishes to dissolve the external friction of their life. To transition from the exhausting performance of believing hard enough to the sovereign authority of the abyss, the individual must implement the practice of the Hadal suspension. This is not a meditation to be practiced in isolation. It is a real-time somatic protocol to be executed when reality presents its most aggressive challenges. To embody this truth today, the moment an individual is confronted by a difficult piece of external data, a negative report from a physician, an unexpected debt, or the silence of a distant loved one, they must refuse to drop into the defensive stance of the fighter. They must recognize that their instinctive desire to panic, to strategize, and to work their way out of the crisis is merely Ren swinging his sword at the empty air. Instead, they must deliberately drop their shoulders, soften the muscles around their eyes, and allow their breath to descend into the lowest chambers of the abdomen without any manual restriction. As the body settles into this physical imitation of the deep ocean floor, they must adjust the radio dial of their mind away from the chaotic surface storm and declare to their own consciousness with an absolute, immovable finality: "This storm is merely an echo on the screen of my past. I do not live on the surface of appearances. I dwell in the deep sanctuary of the end, where my victory is already an ancient, unalterable fact." This shift is not an act of hoping things turn out well. It is the active assumption of a sovereign ruler who has already read the final page of the chronicle. When this state of internal suspension is maintained, the individual moves through their daily tasks with an unhurried, magnetic grace. They stop checking the world for signs of confirmation, for to check for proof is to admit that the fact is still in question. They become the unblinking anchor around which the fluid geometry of their circumstances must stabilize. But as the individual learns to inhabit this majestic immobility, as they become comfortable resting in the dark, silent depths of their own creative law, a subtle and extraordinary shift begins to occur within the fertile soil of their consciousness. The absolute stillness of their state does not remain a blank canvas. Within the silent dark of the deep waters, an invisible, miraculous quickening begins to take place. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to move from the profound depth of the ocean floor to the silent, sacred laboratory of the womb. We must prepare to witness the delicate mathematical mechanics of an architecture that organizes life out of sight and cross the threshold into the deep, radiant darkness known as the mystery of the unseen conception. The chamber is trapped in the suspended amber light of a late winter twilight. Outside the tall, arched window, the world lies frozen in a monochrome trance, a silent landscape where the bare branches of ancient oak trees are limned in brittle hoarfrost, and the earth is locked beneath a dense, unyielding crust of snow. There is no visible movement in the garden, no sign of green rebellion, no validation that life has ever inhabited this cold geography. Sitting quietly by the window pane, bathed in the soft luminescence of the dying sun, is a woman in the earliest weeks of pregnancy. To any external observer, to the casual passerby, or to the cold eye of a scientific instrument, absolutely nothing has changed in her form. Her silhouette remains slender, her skin bears no new marks, her daily movements through the stone manor are unhurried and ordinary. If a cynical auditor were to demand physical proof of her motherhood, she would have no evidence to present. There is no cradle yet constructed, no infant crying in the dark, no swelling of the abdomen to document the mutation of her reality. To the five senses, which report only the historical surface of things, she is exactly who she was a month prior, solitary, unvaried, and empty. Yet, within the absolute dark of her physical vessel, beneath the layer of conscious thought, a monumental and flawless orchestration is unfolding. In the hidden, silent sanctuary of the womb, an intricate blueprint of life is dividing, organizing, and breathing in the deep. Cells are multiplying in accordance with an ancient mathematical code. Microscopic pathways are being laid down. A heartbeat faint as the tap of a bird's wing against a window is establishing its primal rhythm in the dark. This entire creative masterwork takes place without her conscious supervision. She does not lie awake at night wondering if the cellular division is proceeding correctly. She does not perform frantic, white-knuckled rituals to accelerate the growth of the embryo. She does not run to the mirror every hour, scratching at her skin, demandingly checking for outward confirmation that the transformation is real. She simply knows. From that deep, marrow-born certainty, she moves through the cold rooms of the manor with a quality of quiet confidence that requires no external validation. The total absence of visible proof does not disturb her composure. The dead, frozen landscape outside her window cannot shake her internal coordinate. Why would it? She does not hope that a child is forming. She does not wish for the pregnancy to succeed. She has already accepted the reality of the end as an accomplished, unalterable fact. She rests in the stillness of a finished chronicle, completely unbothered by the silence of the interval. To pierce the veil of this expectant certainty, consciousness must look past the biological poetry of motherhood and deconstruct the exact metaphysical mechanics of the gestation interval. One must deploy the method of recursive thinking, turning the analytical lens upon the terrifying void that exists between the internal acceptance of a desire and its external materialization. We must ask the foundational question: why does the human psyche descend into panic and doubt during the period of physical invisibility? And how can an individual maintain absolute fidelity to a reality that the five senses flatly deny? The why of human panic is a consequence of the mind's enslavement to the temporal delay of the material world. When an individual alters the radio dial of their internal state, tuning their consciousness away from the frequency of lack and locking it into the frequency of fulfillment, they expect an instantaneous reorganization of their physical scenery. They forget that the physical world is by its very nature dense, heavy, and plastic. It is an environment of slow-moving matter, a world governed by the laws of delay. When an assumption is made in consciousness, it is instantly accomplished in the timeless realm of potential. However, for that internal reality to project outward, it must pass through the filtering screen of time. The period between the inner conception and the outer birth is not an empty void. It is a period of structural consolidation, a necessary phase where the atoms of the material world are being silently dismantled and reassembled to match the new internal mold. How then does the unawakened seeker sabotage this natural process of gestation? They sabotage it because they do not understand the relationship between the mirror and the shadow. The five senses can only ever report the historical shadow of past states of consciousness. What a man sees with his physical eyes today is not the creative reality of the present moment. It is merely the decaying echo of the thoughts, assumptions, and panics he entertained weeks, months, or years ago. It is a cinematic projection of old data. When a person assumes a new state of being such as wealth, health, or sovereignty, and then immediately looks to their current environment for proof, they are looking at a mirror that is still displaying the reflection of their old clothes. If they see the old shadow of lack and react with a knotted stomach, if they cry out in despair that the practice has failed, they are performing a spiritual miscarriage. Their reaction of panic is a fresh, powerful declaration to the mirror that the desire is absent. They have torn the seed out of the soil to check for roots, destroying the fragile fibers of germination through the sheer velocity of their doubt. True fidelity to the unmanifest requires the total withdrawal of authority from the physical senses. The individual must understand that the absence of visible validation is not an indicator of failure. It is the definitive proof that the conception is currently occupying its necessary hidden phase of development. To check for signs is to admit that the fact is still in question. If the radio dial is genuinely locked onto the station of fulfillment, the individual does not sit in terror wondering if the music will play. They rest in the absolute certainty that the signal is traveling through the ether, completely unbothered by the temporary silence of the speaker. In the heart of the medieval provinces, during a century forgotten by modern historians, the grand town of Saint Mirion was struck by a catastrophic earthquake. In a single terrifying night, the ancient stone basilica that had stood at the center of the community for 400 years collapsed into a mountain of jagged rubble, pulverized mortar, and shattered glass. The townspeople were plunged into an abyss of despair. They looked upon the vacant, muddy lot where their sacred sanctuary once stood and saw only a monument to their abandonment. A month after the ruin, a master architect named Raymond arrived from the distant southern coast. He was a man who moved through the world with an unhurried, royal composure, carrying nothing but a leather cylinder containing thick sheets of vellum and a drafting compass made of blackened iron. On his first morning, Raymond walked out into the center of the ruins. The lot was a disaster of gray mud, stagnant pools of rainwater, rotting timber, and black crows picking at the debris. The townspeople gathered at the edge of the muck, their faces pale, watching the architect with a desperate, frantic intensity. They wanted him to immediately seize a shovel, to begin shouting orders, to start stacking the broken stones by sheer force of muscle, to prove that salvation was underway. Raymond did not touch a single stone. He did not call for laborers, nor did he display a single molecule of urgency. Instead, he walked slowly to the absolute center of the muddy expanse, closed his eyes, and stood perfectly still for an hour. To the townspeople, he appeared to be doing nothing, a passive dreamer, wasting precious time in the face of a civic crisis. But within the quiet theater of Raymond's consciousness, a monumental architecture was being inhabited. He was not imagining a vague hope of a future building. He was actively walking through the finished cathedral. In the silent vault of his mind, he felt the cool, immense shadow of 40-foot limestone pillars. His fingers traced the smooth, completed carvings of the choir stalls. His ears registered the magnificent, deep resonance of the pipe organ echoing against the high transept vaults. His nostrils caught the sharp scent of frankincense and beeswax lingering in the chilled air of the nave. To Raymond, the cathedral was not a project to be built. It was an ancient, unalterable fact that already existed in its completeness. He was not looking at the blueprint, he was looking from the altar. When he opened his eyes, the mud and the crows of St. Marian had lost all authority over his perception. He walked back to his wooden drafting table and began to draw. For months, Raymond lived in a state of absolute, unbothered relaxation. When the town elders ran to his quarters with knotted stomachs, wringing their hands and crying that the winter storms were delaying the delivery of the foundation stones, Raymond did not look up from his parchment. He did not pace the floor or join in their frantic calculations. "Why do you tremble?" Raymond said softly, his voice carrying the deep stability of bedrock. "The delays of the teamsters cannot alter the coordinate of the altar. The cathedral is already standing. I have walked its aisles. I have seen its spires cut the sky. What you call mud is merely the space where the stones are traveling to meet the shape I have already given them. Do not mistake the empty air of the lot for the absence of the temple." Because Raymond remained entirely unmoved by the contrary evidence of the vacant lot, because he held the finished architecture with a bone-deep certainty that defied the mud, his certainty became the invisible gravity that organized the entire province. The right stonemasons appeared from unexpected valleys. A hidden quarry of pristine white marble was discovered in the nearby hills. The gold required for the stained glass arrived via a royal decree that no one had anticipated. 30 years later, when the final spire was hoisted into the clouds, it matched to the millimeter the internal cathedral that Raymond had inhabited on the morning he stood alone, with his eyes closed in the mud. The master builder did not create the cathedral out of the mud. He allowed the finished architecture of his consciousness to compel the mud into compliance. To transition from the panic of the vacant lot to the sovereign peace of the unseen conception, the individual must implement the practice of the gestation sanctuary. This is a deliberate psychological protocol designed to protect the internal seed from the corrosive touch of public opinion and sensory data. To embody this truth today, the individual must learn to treat their deepest desire as a pregnancy that has already successfully occurred within the womb of their mind. The moment a profound desire arises in the heart, whether it be a specific scale of financial freedom, the total restoration of a biological organ, or the realization of a creative destiny, they must explicitly declare to themselves that the conception is a finished historical fact. They must say to their own consciousness with an absolute, quiet finality, "This desire is not a wish for tomorrow. It is the announcement of a life that has already been conceived within me. I leave the womb alone, and I allow the law of development to mature its form in its own perfect season." Once this internal decree is made, the individual must practice the discipline of sensory non-reaction. When they walk through their day and confront the vacant lot of their current circumstances, the low bank balance, the empty room, or the physical symptom, they must refuse to let the shadow dictate their internal posture. They must look at the lack not as a crisis to be fought, but as the harmless mud of St. Marion, the temporary space through which the finished reality is traveling to meet them. They stop demanding proof of germination from the mirror. They walk with the unhurried, grounded gait of a woman who carries an empire in her dark, needing no external confirmation to justify her peace. But as the individual settles into this quiet, expectant certainty, as they learn to protect the unseen seed from their own analytical doubt, they discover that the greatest challenge to their rest does not come from the silence of the mud. It comes from the noisy, aggressive theater of the collective world outside. As they move through their days with an unhurried grace, they find themselves passing through an ancient, crowded city where the citizens are engaged in an entirely different liturgy. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to leave the quiet sanctuary of the womb and confront the loud, clanking machinery of human society. For at the gates of the city stands a massive, centuries-old institution, a collective of souls who have weaponized suffering, who view ease as a spiritual crime, and who demand that every traveler bow before the altars of exhaustion. To ensure the safe birth of the unseen conception, one must dare to march directly into the heart of this collective madness, look upon its iron badges of honor with an unblinking eye, and dismantle forever the terrifying illusion known as the cult of hardship. The gate of the ancient city of Orosvale is forged from pig iron, weeping orange lines of rust-down stone pillars that have been blackened by centuries of soot. Through this narrow portal, a grim and endless procession moves in absolute rhythmic conformity. The air is thick with the metallic tang of sweat, the scraping of leather soles against jagged granite, and the low, collective groan of a populace locked in a state of perpetual exertion. Look upon the citizens inhabiting this grey metropolis. Every individual is draped in heavy ornamental iron chains that encircle their necks, cross their chests, and trail behind them in the dust like dead weights. These chains are not imposed by a foreign conqueror. They are crafted, polished, and maintained by the citizens themselves. They treat their bruises not as injuries, but as badges of holy authority. A man who drags a 100-pound boulder behind him is cleared a path of deep respect. A woman whose shoulders are permanently curved under a yoke of lead is bowed to as a paragon of seriousness. In the taverns and public squares, the conversations do not revolve around joy, discovery, or the expansion of light. Instead, the elders gather to compare the depth of their scars, evaluating one another's devotion by the degree of exhaustion etched into the hollows of their cheeks. Hardship is the official currency of the realm. Suffering is the ultimate proof of an individual's right to exist. On a morning when the sky is the color of wet slate, a stranger approaches the iron gate. He carries no luggage. His hands are completely empty. He wears a simple, unadorned robe of spun white linen that shifts fluidly with the wind. He does not run. He does not stride with the aggressive momentum of a man chasing a deadline. He steps across the jagged threshold light as a feather, his feet moving with an unhurried royal grace, his posture straight and sovereign, his jaw completely soft. He looks upon the groaning citizens not with judgment, but with a quiet, clear, and unblinking serenity. The effect of his lightness is an immediate and violent pattern interruption within the city walls. The rhythmic clanking of iron chains sputters and halts. The citizens stop in their tracks, lowering their burdens into the mud, staring at the stranger with an expression of deep, defensive suspicion. Whispers ripple through the soot-choked alleys like dry leaves. They do not see his freedom as a blessing. They perceive it as an insult, an act of profound irresponsibility, a dangerous heresy against the law of the soil. "Where are your chains?" an elder demands, his voice trembling with a bitter rage as he points a deformed finger at the stranger's unblemished linen. "How dare you walk among us without a burden? If you do not suffer, your presence here is a lie. An unearned freedom is an illegitimate freedom. If life is not hard for you, it is because you are a thief or a fool." The stranger does not offer an apology. He does not reach for a chain to appease the crowd. He remains perfectly, beautifully still in the center of the hostile square, a monument of ease in a kingdom built upon the glorification of agony. The paradox is stark and absolute. The citizens of Orosvale have become so deeply enslaved by their devotion to friction that they view the natural state of human freedom as an act of cosmic treason. To understand the profound madness of Orosvale, consciousness must look past the theatrical display of societal labor and perform a rigorous psychological autopsy on the human defense mechanisms that link worthiness to suffering. One must look into the ancestral vaults of human conditioning and deploy the method of recursive thinking, asking the foundational question, why does the human mind instinctively treat ease as a suspicious illusion, and how does the belief in necessary struggle actively lock the creative mechanism of reality into a loop of perpetual lack? The why is rooted in the ego's primal need for a narrative of self-glorification. The ego is by its very nature an isolationist structure. It thrives on the concept of personal achievement achieved against overwhelming odds. If a desire, whether it be a vast fortune, a miraculous healing, or an exquisite relationship arrives easily, without a prior history of weeping and gnashing of teeth, the ego is robbed of its favorite monument. It cannot beat its chest. It cannot claim that it conquered the mountain through its own unique grit and determination. To accept that fulfillment is an unconditional gift of consciousness is to demand the total psychological execution of the ego's pride. Therefore, the mind instinctively prefers a magnificent, exhausting failure over an effortless victory, for within the failure, its identity as a tragic warrior remains secure. How, then, does this collective addiction to hardship dictate the behavior of the external world? It operates through the absolute and mechanical precision of the mirror of consciousness. Consciousness does not evaluate reality based on the noble intentions or the intellectual definitions held by the seeker. It registers only the dominant structural assumption that animates the internal state. When an individual approaches their life with the belief that anything worth having must be hard to get, they are not merely stating an opinion, they are tuning the radio dial of their subconscious mind to the frequency of absolute resistance. Let us trace the geometry of this trap. The individual who believes that struggle is evidence of seriousness will consciously or unconsciously seek out paths of maximum friction. If a door opens before them with a fluid, natural ease, they will pull back from it with a knotted stomach, whispering that it must be a trap, that it is too good to be true. They will choose instead the path that requires them to clench their jaw, grit their teeth, and visualize through a haze of exhaustion. They believe that their worry is an act of responsibility, that their anxiety is a protective shield keeping disaster at bay. The mirror of reality looks upon this white-knuckled performance and reflects it with perfect fidelity. It does not deliver the peace the individual claims to want. It delivers a physical environment that matches the armor they are wearing. It produces unexpected blockages, bureaucratic delays, financial crises, and interpersonal conflicts. The seeker looks upon this chaotic landscape and shouts triumphantly, "See, I told you life was hard." They do not realize that the hostility of their world is merely the echo of their own defensive posture. They are fighting the shadow of an enemy they have manufactured with their own structural assumptions. This is the ultimate trap within the trap. The belief that struggle is necessary is itself the very creative engine that is producing the resistance, forcing the individual to remain a slave to an iron ledger of their own design. In the ancient, pre-classical myths of the Western archipelago, long before the first stone temples were raised to the sky, there lived a titan named Astrion. He dwelt upon the absolute peak of the Mount of Broken Granite, a jagged spire that pierced the absolute center of the heavens. For 3,000 years, Astrion had lived in a state of unremitting, agonizing exertion. His colossal frame was permanently hunched. His thigh muscles were locked like gnarled oak roots into the stone of the mountain. His massive hands were thrust upward, palms flat against the dark, vast slate of the night sky. His veins throbbed against his temples like twisting serpents. His chest heaved in short, shallow gasps. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with an ancient, unblinking terror. Astrion was the ultimate martyr of the cosmos. He had been told by the old gods that he was the sole pillar of existence. The conditioning ran through his very marrow. He believed with an absolute, unshakable conviction that the weight of the entire universe rested upon the endurance of his muscles. He believed that if he allowed his shoulders to drop for a single inch, if he relaxed the white-knuckled grip of his fingers for a fractional second, the massive dome of the stars would fracture, tumbling down to crush the earth, the seas, and all of humanity into an absolute, irreversible nothingness. His labor was his religion. When the eagles came to peck at his calloused shoulders, he did not brush them away, viewing their bites as a confirmation of his seriousness. When the mountain winds brought the scent of sweet wine and the sound of laughter from the human valleys below, Astrion ground his teeth together, his heart swelling with a bitter, self-righteous pride. Let them dance. The titan would growl through his clenched jaw, his tears freezing into salt crusts on his cheeks. They only live because my agony never ceases. They are light because I am heavy. They do not know the responsibility of the sky. He monitored his strength sleeplessly, constantly shifting his weight, bracing his core against imagined tremors in the ether, terrified that if his attention drifted, the cosmos would forget how to stay aloft. On the night of the winter solstice, in the 3,000th year of his vigil, a catastrophic exhaustion claimed him. It was not a choice. It was the total failure of his biological machinery. The low-grade fever of his perpetual anxiety had finally burned through his reserves. His vision darkened. His magnificent thigh muscles dissolved into water. His fingers lost their grip on the vault of the stars. With a long, terminal groan of absolute defeat, Astrion's knees buckled. He fell forward, his colossal body tumbling off the peak of the mountain, crashing down through the clouds to land flat on his back in the deep, soft grass of the valley floor. As his consciousness drifted back into his eyes, a cold, absolute terror gripped his heart. He clamped his eyelids shut, bracing his body for the impact of the falling stars, waiting for the sky to collapse and erase his existence. 5 minutes passed. The earth remained solid beneath his back. The air was sweet, smelling of clover and damp earth. Slowly, with a trembling hesitation, Astrion opened his eyes. He looked up at the summit of the mount of broken granite. The peak was entirely empty. The stone tongue where he had stood for 3 millennia was bare. Yet, as his eyes traveled further upward, he gasped a sound that shook the leaves of the valley forest. The sky had not fallen. The vast, dark dome of the stars remained perfectly, breathtakingly in place. The silver river of the cosmos was wheeling with a majestic, silent, and fluid grace, its celestial geometry completely undisturbed. The constellations did not require his straining muscles to hold them aloft. The moon did not need his panic to navigate its silver arc. The universe was being sustained by an unseen, effortless, and self-contained law, a physics of absolute grace that had been operating perfectly while he was breaking his bones on the peak. His 3,000 years of agony had changed nothing. His struggle had not been a pillar of the cosmos, but merely a long, dark wall that had kept him too exhausted to ever see the beauty of the lights he believed he was saving. The liberation of the sky-bearer is the precise manual of release required by every seeker who has been trained to believe that their worry is a useful force in the universe. To step out of the cult of hardship and dissolve the iron badges of Horus Vale, the individual must implement the practice of the armor relinquishment. This is an intentional psychological divorce from the utility of suffering to be executed the moment the mind attempts to validate its worth through its stress. To embody this truth today, the individual must learn to intercept the voice of the collective conditioning. The moment they catch themselves thinking that an easy solution is irresponsible, or that they must remain anxious about an outcome to prove they care, they must mentally stand before the mirror of their consciousness and strip away the iron clothes of the martyr. They must drop their shoulders, unclench their teeth, and deliver a silent, unbending decree to their own spirit. My suffering is not currency. The universe does not require my agony to buy its fulfillment. I drop the weight of the sky, and I trust the law that holds the stars to carry my heart. This shift is an act of supreme spiritual audacity. It is the refusal to pay the unnecessary tax of friction to an imaginary master. The individual steps into their daily tasks with an entirely different quality of presence. They no longer perform their practices as an exam to be graded. They inhabit them as an inheritance to be enjoyed. They walk with the light, unburdened step of the stranger at the gate, completely unbothered by the groans of a world that is still addicted to the sledgehammer. But as the individual drops the iron chains of the mind, as they allow their spirit to descend into the deep, unbothered valleys of absolute ease, an extraordinary and cataclysmic reaction begins to ripple through the physical vessel itself. The release of the psychological armor does not remain a localized mental event. The cells of the body, long accustomed to being a fortress braced for an impending assault, suddenly register the total cessation of hostilities. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to zoom inward, passing through the surface of the skin, past the muscle fibers of the locked jaw, and directly into the deep, radiant fluid of the biological matrix. For when the mind enters the absolute rest of the sovereign Sabbath, it triggers an immediate, miraculous rewrite of the physical kingdom. We must prepare to witness the biological transmutation of presence and cross the threshold into the deep, majestic laboratory known as the alchemy of the anatomy. The transformation of reality does not announce itself with a thunderclap in the heavens. It begins with the subtle, silent relaxation of a single muscle fiber beneath the skin. If a powerful cinematic lens could pierce the dermal architecture of an individual caught in the throes of the modern struggle, it would reveal a landscape of profound anatomical siege. The jaw is a locked vice, the masseter muscles clamped together with a white-knuckled intensity that telegraphs an unending state of emergency to the deep centers of the brain. The breath is shallow, ragged, and confined entirely to the upper chambers of the thoracic cage, behaving like the respiration of a creature pursued by an apex predator through a primordial forest. The shoulders are drawn upward and forward, creating a defensive posture, a human fortress permanently braced against an anticipated blow from an invisible adversary. The capillaries are constricted, the extremities are cold, and the ocular muscles are fixed in a sharp, hyper-vigilant focus, scanning the external environment for signs of threat or validation. Then, the observer witnesses a monumental, silent miracle. Without the introduction of any external chemical, without the enforcement of a manual command, an internal shift of assumption occurs within the chamber of consciousness. Instantly, the biological blueprint is rewritten. The locked jaw subtly unhinges, the dense masseter muscles melting into a state of fluid ease. The shoulders drop backward and downward, releasing their ancient grip on the skeletal framework, aligning themselves effortlessly with the natural gravity of a supportive earth. Most profoundly, the breath escapes its thoracic cage. It drops deeply, smoothly, and without a single molecule of human forcing, descending into the absolute depths of the diaphragm and the pelvic bowl. The breath becomes a slow, resonant wave, in, out, operating with the majestic, unhurried cadence of an ocean tide. The paradox presented to the analytical mind is absolute. The individual's external circumstances have not altered by a single fraction. The bank ledger remains unchanged, the room is still silent, and the material world has delivered no sensory proof of victory. Yet, the physical vessel is behaving as though it has already inherited an empire. The flesh has stepped out of the historical timeline of struggle and has entered a profound biological homeostasis. The nervous system has ceased its warfare, trading the frantic energy of survival for the regal composure of absolute possession. The body has become a living testament to a reality that the eyes cannot yet behold, revealing that the true sanctuary of fulfillment is first established within the very marrow of the bone. To comprehend the biological chemistry of this somatic mutation, consciousness must deploy the incisive scalpel of recursive thinking. One must look past the superficial sensations of physical relaxation and demand to know the fundamental why and how of this anatomical rewiring. Why does the physical body mirror the internal assumptions of lack with such violent fidelity? And how does the transition into the state of the wish fulfilled alter the literal magnetic field of the human vessel? The why is rooted in a profound metaphysical truth that modern psychology is only beginning to glimpse. The physical body is not a separate, mechanical vehicle driven by the mind. It is the subconscious mind itself, expressed in a dense, visible form. The flesh is the literal crystallization of an individual's dominant internal state. When a person operates from an assumption of lack, believing that their desire is separate from them, absent, and must be hunted down through exhausting effort, they are suffering from a chronic, low-grade psychological fever. This internal panic acts as a constant destructive electrical current pouring through the nervous system. The body, acting as a faithful servant, has no choice but to organize its tissues into a physical manifestation of that emergency. It builds the armor of the locked jaw and the shallow breath to match the internal assumption of hostility. How then does the absolute surrender to the wish fulfilled initiate an immediate biological alchemy? It operates by shifting the radio dial of the nervous system away from the static of survival and tuning it directly to the resonant frequency of absolute completion. When the mind genuinely accepts that the desire is already an accomplished historical fact, the brain ceases to fire the neural pathways of threat. The sympathetic nervous system, the engine of fight, flight, and frantic striving, is instantly decommissioned. In its place, the parasympathetic majesty of the organism takes command. The blood vessels dilate, the life force cascades freely into the vital organs, and the hormonal cascade shifts from the corrosive chemistry of cortisol to the expansive chemistry of restoration. Let us examine this shift through the unyielding law of the mirror. The universal consciousness does not create from the abstract concepts held in the intellect. It responds to the dense, total resonance of the self. When an individual visualizes their goal while maintaining a tense, braced body, the mirror ignores the beautiful mental imagery entirely. It registers only the somatic contraction. It detects the shallow breath and the clenched teeth, classifying the individual as a beggar pleading from the cold steps of the castle. When the body genuinely arrives in the moment through absolute relaxation, it becomes a monolith of presence. This presence is not a passive spacing out. It is an active, dense, and sovereign state of energetic mass. By softening the anatomy, the individual removes the internal friction that was previously scattering their creative power. They stop casting the shadow of defense upon the canvas of their life. The radio dial is locked into the station of fulfillment, and the physical vessel becomes a highly efficient transmitter of a singular, uncompromised frequency. The body is no longer a tool used to chase the echo of a distant dream. It has become the very coordinate where reality must stabilize itself. In the high vertical labyrinths of the western ridge, where the mountain peaks cut the sky like jagged teeth of obsidian, there flowed a river known as the Gorge of Strife. Born from the violent melting of glacial caps, the river was a theater of unmitigated chaos. It rushed through narrow, rocky ravines with a deafening, frantic velocity, battering itself against ancient boulders, leaping over precipices in explosions of blind white foam. The water of the Gorge of Strife was perpetually opaque. Because of its intense velocity, it ripped the silt from the canyon floor, suspending clouds of gray mud, sand, and sharp gravel within its current. It was a violent, blind torrent, incapable of containing life, fighting every contour of the stone channels that bound it, screaming through the stone corridors like a creature caught in a nightmare of endless pursuit. If a man stood on the edge of the gorge and looked down into its waters, he could see nothing. The river could not reflect the deep emerald of the surrounding cedar forests. It could not capture the brilliant gold of the morning sun. It could not register the infinite depth of the midnight stars. It was too busy fighting its own movement, too frantic in its rush to reach an imagined destination in the lowlands, completely blind to the scenery it was tearing to pieces along its path. After a journey of 40 miles through the jagged ravines, the river encountered a sudden monumental geographic shift. The narrow rock walls of the canyon fell away, opening up into a vast, ancient, and perfectly flat valley basin known as the Meadow of the Silent King. The water did not stop flowing, but its relationship with the earth was instantly transformed. Lacking the restrictive, hostile walls of the gorge, the river expanded. It became wide, deep, and unhurried. The frantic velocity dropped to absolute zero. The water entered a state of profound, majestic relaxation, spreading across the vast basin until it became a massive, still lake that seemed to hold the entire valley in its lap. In this space of complete stillness, a miraculous alchemy occurred. Because the water had ceased its violent friction, the suspended silt, the mud, and the sharp gravel began to lose their buoyancy. Slowly, steadily, without any manual filtering, the weights dropped. The sediment sank to the absolute bottom of the basin, burying itself in the deep dark of the earth. The water became perfectly, breathtakingly transparent. The surface of the lake transformed into a pristine liquid mirror of absolute, unblinking clarity. It no longer fought the landscape, it inhabited it. On its flawless glass surface, the lake reflected the massive, snow-capped peaks of the mountains with a precision that rivaled reality. It captured the slow, elegant dance of the clouds. It gathered the entire vault of the night sky, weaving the stars into its dark depths until the lake and the heavens became a singular, indistinguishable canvas of light. The river had not achieved this beauty by striving to look beautiful. It had commanded the entire majesty of the cosmos into its form by simply learning how to settle. In this moment of profound physiological release, as the jaw unclenches and the breath deepens, a natural pause emerges within the vast basin of the mind. Liking this transmission signals to the deep architecture of algorithms that this standard of truth must be broadcast further, anchoring this piece into the collective mind and allowing the frantic torrent of humanity to find its own sovereign valley of rest. The lake did not need to run after the mountain or beg the stars to shine upon its waters. By the simple fact of its absolute unmoving clarity, the grandest features of the universe were compelled to lie down within its embrace. The transition of the violent river into the crystalline lake is the exact anatomical roadmap required by the individual who seeks to manifest their highest destiny. The body cannot remain a chaotic gorge of stress if it wishes to reflect the harmony of fulfillment. To dissolve the biological sediment of anxiety, the individual must implement the practice of the somatic resonance calibration. This is a real-time anatomical audit to be executed multiple times throughout the day, transforming the physical vessel from a weapon of pursuit into a temple of attraction. To embody this truth today, the individual must establish an internal alarm that triggers not at a specific hour, but at the detection of any somatic contraction. The moment they notice the jaw tightening during a conversation, the breath catching during an email, or the shoulders rising against a deadline, they must refuse to let the mind continue its frantic calculations. They must pause their physical movement entirely. In this suspension, they must direct their conscious awareness to the tense tissue, intentionally releasing the masseter muscles until a slight space forms between the upper and lower teeth. They must allow the shoulders to drop down, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the arms. Then they must draw a deep, unhurried breath through the nose, guiding the air past the chest, allowing the abdomen to expand completely like a soft balloon. As the breath flows out, they must deliver an absolute, bone-deep decree to their own selves. The warfare is ended. The victory is already written into the ledger of my flesh. My cells rest in the finished fact, and I allow my world to conform to the piece of my template. This practice is the literal manipulation of the radio dial of human biology. It rewires the nervous system, forcing the body to step out of the identity of the hunter and step into the identity of the heir. The individual returns to their daily tasks moving with a slow, deliberate, and magnetic grace, refusing to let the illusions of external urgency dictate the posture of their muscles. As the physical vessel is brought into this absolute alignment, as the biological alchemy stabilizes the template of resonance, an extraordinary and mysterious phenomenon begins to ripple across the borders of the external world. The absolute stillness of the anatomy acts like a stone dropped into the center of a glassy pond. The individual notices that their circumstances are no longer sitting in a state of stagnant resistance. The outer scenery is beginning to tremble, to slide, and to shift its position in the dark without a single human hand touching the gears. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to leave the internal biology of the vessel and look out upon the grand external landscape of destiny. For the current of the assumption is finally free to move, and the unseen hands of the cosmos are already assembling a spectacular, unexpected highway of coincidences. We must prepare to watch the material world bend its knee to the internal template and step across the threshold into the elegant, mathematical orchestration known as the Bridge of Incidence. Within the dim, amber-lit sanctuary of an ancient horological workshop, the atmosphere smells of refined whale oil, shaved brass filings, and the dry, paper scent of long-archived schematics. Thousands of clocks line the dark oak walls, pendulums of varying lengths swinging in a discordant, chaotic clatter of individual timings, each small mechanism fiercely asserting its own isolated rhythm. The master watchmaker stands before a workbench wrapped in heavy emerald green velvet. With a single, unhurried motion, he upturns a leather pouch, scattering a chaotic handful of watch components across the soft cloth. To the uninitiated eye, the table is instantly littered with a disastrous, incomprehensible maze of silver teeth wheels, delicate brass pinions, uncoiled hairsprings, and microscopic ruby pivots. They lie frozen in an absolute state of disarray. According to every known law of manual labor, the restoration of order to this scattered metallic landscape would require hundreds of hours of agonizing, white-knuckled manipulation under a magnifying loupe, tweezers trembling with tension, eyes straining through the dusk to force each stubborn gear into its designated slot. Then, an extraordinary paradox occurs. The watchmaker does not reach for his tools. He does not touch a single gear. Instead, beneath the heavy timber of the workbench, an immense, hidden electromagnetic current is silently activated. Instantly, the emerald velvet table becomes a live theater of fluid reorganization. The scattered gears do not simply roll. They slide across the fabric with an uncanny magnetic intelligence drawn by an invisible underlying architecture of force. A tiny escapement wheel spins on its axis, gliding smoothly into alignment with a golden balance wheel. The hairspring coils itself back into a perfect, uniform spiral. The ruby pivots slide effortlessly into the tiny openings of the brass plates. Within a succession of silent, fluid movements, the scattered fragments lock together, their teeth meshing with an elegant, frictionless precision. Before a single human hand has applied a wrench or a screw, the completely assembled pocket watch begins to tick, its heartbeat resonant and uniform, vibrating with the voice of a finished creation. The material world has bypassed the necessity of human force. The arrangement has occurred not through external pushing or frantic assembly from the outside in, but through the irresistible pull of a foundational field established beneath the surface of things. This is the majestic geometry of reality when internal friction is removed. The scenery of the external world ceases to be a collection of stubborn obstacles and transforms into an elastic, responsive medium that slides effortlessly into alignment with the dominant charge of the soul. To understand the mechanics of this spontaneous choreography, consciousness must drop beneath the superficial illusion of coincidences and deploy a rigorous method of recursive thinking. One must interrogate the very fabric of time and spatial distance to ask the foundational questions. Why does the external world appear to possess its own independent intelligent mobility when an internal state is stabilized? And how does the mechanism of the bridge of incidence construct its highways through the material world? The why demands a total dismantling of the classical paradigm of cause and effect. The unawakened mind lives under the tyranny of the belief that to move from point A to point B in life, one must manually build every inch of the road through physical exertion. It views reality as a dense, non-negotiable quarry of cold stone. But when consciousness turns its gaze inward, it discovers that reality is not an independent structure at all. It is the mirror of an infinite, unified intelligence. Space and time are not barriers. They are the plastic coordinates through which consciousness projects its current identity. When an individual changes the radio dial of their internal state, moving completely out of the frequency of wanting and locking their awareness into the frequency of having, a cataclysmic collapse of probability occurs within the unseen field. The individual has established a new metaphysical gravity. The external world, which is nothing more than the shadow of this internal posture, is instantly compelled by its own nature to adjust its reflection. It cannot resist, for a shadow has no power to maintain an old shape when the object casting it has moved. How then does this structural reorganization manifest in the daily life of the individual? It manifests through what is known as the bridge of incidence, a series of natural, seemingly accidental, and beautifully orchestrated events that link the moment of internal assumption to the moment of physical materialization. The ego, in its frantic desire to control, believes that it must plan every step of this bridge. It sits up at night constructing elaborate strategies, trying to calculate how the money will arrive, how the door will open, or how the right individual will be encountered. But the ego's calculations are limited by the historical data of the five senses. It can only project from past failures. The bridge of incidence, conversely, is constructed by the infinite intelligence of the law. It operates with an elegance that defies human calculation. It uses the ordinary currents of daily life to deliver the extraordinary result. A casual conversation overheard in a crowded terminal, a wrong number dialed by a stranger, a sudden, unexplained impulse to walk down a different street, a bureaucratic delay that places the individual in the exact room where their destiny is waiting. These are the fluid gears of the watch sliding into place under the influence of the internal magnet. The individual does not need to manufacture the bridge, they are carried across it. Every event on the bridge, whether it appears positive or negative to the superficial intellect, is a necessary stone laid down by the law to ensure the safe passage of the soul into its inheritance. To attempt to force the bridge through anxious action is the equivalent of reaching onto the green velvet table to push the gears with your fingers, disrupting the clean, magnetic alignment with the clumsy friction of your doubt. In the maritime archives of the old merchant republics, there is a legendary chronicle concerning the galleon Aeon's Wake and its passage through the shrouded archipelago. The archipelago was a vast, terrifying maritime labyrinth, 100 miles of shifting sandbars, hidden granite reefs that could rip the belly out of a wooden ship in an instant, and a perpetual, milk-white fog that hung over the water like a dense, freezing shroud. For 3 days, the Aeon's Wake had been trapped in the belly of this white vacuum. The crew was in a state of unmitigated panic and total exhaustion. Believing that their survival depended entirely on the brute force of their labor, the captain had ordered 50 men into the lower bays to man the massive heavy sweep oars. The sailors broke their backs, rowing frantically through the blind mist, their muscles tearing, their hands bleeding into the wood as they tried to force the massive hull through the unseen channels. The navigator stood at the bow, his face pale, screaming contradictory orders through the fog, trying to check charts that had become completely useless as the currents spun the vessel in circles. Every movement of the ship was an agony of friction. The more frantically the men rowed, the more violently the hull seemed to graze against the hidden teeth of the coral below. The air was filled with the rhythmic, desperate thud-thud-thud of the oars, and the screams of a crew terrified of imminent deletion. They were fighting the sea, fighting the fog, and fighting the invisibility of their destination. On the midnight of the third watch, Captain Vane stepped onto the quarterdeck. He was a man who had spent years studying the silent mechanics of the deep waters. He looked down into the rowing bays and saw men collapsing from sheer fatigue. He looked out at the white wall of the fog and recognized that their frantic striving was based entirely on the structural assumption of their lostness. They were rowing from a place of panic, and their very labor was driving them deeper into the maze. "Tie down the oars," Captain Vane commanded, his voice cutting through the damp chill of the deck with a strange, heavy authority. "Cease the rowing. Lay down the charts." The first mate stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Captain, if we stop pushing, the current will drift us onto the shoals. If we do not fight this mist, we are dead men." "Our fighting is the thing that is blinding us to the true highway," Vane replied calmly. "We have turned our ship into a weapon against the ocean. Drop the oars, secure the rudders, and stand down." The crew, believing their commander had descended into a state of suicidal madness, had no choice but to obey the unbending sovereignty of his tone. The massive wooden sweep oars were pulled from the water and lashed to the hull. The shouting of the officers ceased. The frantic running across the decks came to an absolute sudden halt. A monumental, heavy silence descended over the Aeon's wake. For the first 10 minutes, the ship appeared to float aimlessly in the white void, a dead weight at the mercy of the elements. But as the noise of human friction was completely silenced, the hull began to respond to a deeper, grander physics. Without the erratic propulsion of the oars, the ship settled perfectly into its true displacement weight. It dropped into the deep, invisible spine of the Great Meridian Current, a massive, warm thermal highway that moved through the absolute depths of the archipelago, flowing with a silent, majestic velocity toward the open sea. The voyage transformed into a miracle of absolute automation. The deep current caught the keel of the galleon like an invisible cradle. Without a single sail hoisted, without a single oar touching the water, the Aeon's wake began to glide through the razor-sharp reefs with a fluid, uncanny grace. The current naturally repelled the hull away from the shallow sandbars. It guided the ship through the twisting, serpentine channels of the labyrinth with a precision that no human navigator could ever hope to mimic. The men stood at the railings in absolute silence, watching the jagged teeth of black rock slide past them through the fog, mere inches away, yet the ship never grazed a single stone. The ocean itself was weaving their escape. At dawn, the milk-white shroud of the archipelago suddenly fractured and dissolved. The Aeon's wake shot out into the open, sapphire expanses of the southern sea, its hull completely unblemished, its crew rested and whole. Before them lay the golden harbor of their destination, glittering in the first rays of the morning sun. They had reached the haven not because they had conquered the sea through the agony of their muscles, but because they had possessed the immense courage to drop their oars and allow the deep law of the current to do what human panic had only ever delayed. The liberation of the merchant vessel is the precise operational manual for the individual who wishes to witness the materialization of their highest desires without the exhausting interference of human planning. The bridge of incidents cannot be walked by a mind that insists on manually laying down every plank through anxiety. To allow the deep current of reality to organize your highway, the individual must implement the practice of the non-interference vigil. To embody this truth today, the individual must learn to identify the exact moments when they are attempting to manually force the echo of reality. When an individual steps out of their state of inner fulfillment and begins to frantically check the external world for progress, asking how it will happen, when it will arrive, or who will deliver it, they must immediately recognize this behavior as the crew reaching for the heavy sweep oars in the fog. In that moment of awareness, the individual must explicitly declare an internal armistice. They must sit quietly, soften their biology, and deliver an absolute decree to their own analytical intellect. I drop the oars of my strategic planning. I do not need to construct the road, for the law has already laid down the bridge from the end to the beginning. My only task is to remain immovable in the state of fulfillment and allow the scenery to move on its own. This practice demands a supreme, regal quality of mental discipline. It requires the individual to look at temporary blockages, unexpected delays, or strange turns of events on the external screen of life without reacting with a knotted stomach. They must treat every event on their path as a necessary, intelligent turning of the watch gears, understanding that what appears to be a detour to the analytical mind is actually the shortest distance between their current coordinate and the final harvest. They walk through their day with the unhurried composure of a passenger riding on a majestic train, completely untroubled by the darkness of the tunnels, knowing that the tracks have been laid down by a master engineer and lead inevitably to the station. But as the individual masters this state of non-interference, as they learn to watch the scenery of their life slide into place with a frictionless magnetic grace, a deeper and more subtle inquiry arises within the chambers of their awareness. If the current of reality moves the ship effortlessly, what is the nature of human action within this kingdom of grace? Does the individual become a static ghost, doing nothing at all, or does their movement undergo a radical transformation of quality? The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to move from the deep current of the ocean highway to the quiet, sun-drenched soil of the open fields. For the bridge is leading the traveler directly toward a vast emerald landscape where a solitary cultivator is moving through the rows without a single trace of strain. We must prepare to discover the profound distinction between the forced labor of the servant and the inspired expression of the master, and cross the threshold into the flawless, natural mechanics known as the law of the invisible harvest. The midnight air over the high valleys of the plateau is heavy with the scent of damp loam, crushed sage, and the electric tension of an impending storm. The landscape is a study in absolute obsidian darkness, broken only by the feeble amber halo of a single oil lantern resting on the edge of a freshly plowed field. The long, symmetrical ridges of earth stretch out into the gloom like the ribs of a slumbering leviathan, completely silent, utterly motionless, locked in the profound stillness of the planting season. Kneeling in the black dirt is a cultivator whose movements are frantic, ragged, and dictated by an overarching terror of ruin. His hands are caked with mud, his fingernails torn down to the quick. In his right hand he wields a rusted iron trowel, its blade catching the dull glint of the lantern light. Driven by an unremitting psychological panic, an inability to endure the absolute silence of the subterranean world, the man plunges the metal tool into the center of a ridge. He tears open the earth with a desperate velocity, throwing aside the heavy clods of dirt until his trembling fingers locate a pale, small seed buried 3 inches beneath the surface. He holds the seed up to the light, his breath coming in shallow, anxious gasps. He turns it over, scraping away the clinging soil to check for microscopic signs of life, demanding to know if the root has sprouted, if the membrane has ruptured, if the silent dark has obeyed his frantic ambition. In his hyper-vigilant investigation, his rough skin inadvertently shears through the invisible, hair-like fibers of the first fragile rootlet that had just begun to anchor itself to the matrix of the earth. He cleanses the seed, finds its progress insufficient to calm the low-grade fever of his mind, and buries it once more, pounding the dirt flat above it with a clenched fist. An hour later, driven by the same insatiable demon of doubt, he will move to the next ridge and repeat the interrogation. The tragedy unfolding beneath the stars is an absolute paradox of effort. The cultivator believes that his frantic labor is a manifestation of his seriousness, that his midnight vigilance is the very fuel that ensures his survival. He cannot see that his spade is a weapon of execution. His refusal to yield to the silence of the soil is the exact creative engine that guarantees the barrenness of his land. He is transforming a fertile cradle into a cemetery of ruptured seeds, completely blind to the foundational truth that the law of growth does not require the anxious supervision of the hands that initiated the drop. To dismantle the illusion of frantic labor, consciousness must withdraw its attention from the theater of manual production and deploy a rigorous method of recursive thinking. One must halt the frantic cultivator, strip away his tools, and force an interrogation into the deep, structural chambers of human action. We must ask the primary, analytical questions. Why does the human psyche instinctively believe that effective action must be characterized by friction, sweat, and exhaustion? And how does the energetic origin of an action dictate the literal quality of the material world it produces? The why is a direct consequence of the ego's historical exile from the realm of grace. The unawakened mind operates under the absolute assumption that it lives within a hostile mechanical universe where resources are scarce and everything of value must be wrestled from the hands of a resisting reality. To the ego, action is a tool of defense. It believes that if it stops pushing, if it stops striving, if it stops monitoring its reality with a knotted stomach, the universe will simply forget its existence, leaving it to dissolve into nothingness. The mind has weaponized the concept of work, transforming it from a joyous expression of life into a desperate negotiation for survival. How then does the law of consciousness sort these actions into two separate non-negotiable categories of harvest? It operates through the absolute precision of the radio dial of internal state. Every action performed by a human being carries an invisible, defining imprint, the energetic frequency of the assumption from which it was born. When an individual acts from a state of anxiety, their movement is an attempt to force an outcome from the outside in. They make the phone call, write the contract, or execute the strategy because they believe that if they do not manipulate the material world by force, their desire will remain absent. Let us trace this through the mechanics of the mirror. The mirror of reality does not respond to the outer form of the action. It responds to the dominant assumption behind it. If a man works 20 hours a day to build a fortune because his stomach is sick with the fear of poverty, the mirror ignores the brilliant strategy and the long hours. It registers only the fear. It detects the assumption of lack that is driving the work. Therefore, the mirror is bound by its own nature to reflect an environment where the wealth achieved must be defended by more exhausting labor, creating a golden cage that requires the same white-knuckled strain to maintain as it did to build. The action has merely perpetuated the crisis it was designed to escape. Conversely, there is action that flows from an entirely different coordinate on the radio dial, the action of assumption. This is movement that arises from the inside out, the natural, almost involuntary outgrowth of a state of consciousness that has already accepted the reality of the end. The individual does not act to get their desire. They act because their desire is already an established historical fact within their awareness, and the action is the fluid execution of that victory. This movement does not feel like striving. It does not deplete the biological reserves of the vessel. It feels like natural expression, behaving like the shadow that follows a body as it walks through the light. When consciousness is settled in the bone-deep acceptance of fulfillment, the actions drawn out of the individual are entirely different in quality. They are precise, effortless, and often completely disproportionate to the material effort involved. The individual finds themselves drawn to a specific location, inspired to speak a particular word, or moved to execute a simple task, not because they have calculated a strategy, but because the action feels completely natural to who they are being. Consciousness is the only soil that exists, the assumption is the seed, and the law of reality is the invisible engine that matures the harvest. The role of the human being is not to make the seed grow, but to possess the supreme, sovereign discipline to leave the soil alone, allowing the involuntary mechanics of grace to deliver the form without the requirement of human agony. In the forgotten high valleys of the eastern Cordillera, suspended between the clouds and the vertical granite cliffs, lay the legendary Valley of the Glass Terraces. The valley was home to two master horticulturists, Garrick and Linnea, who were tasked by the elders of the realm with cultivating the rare celestial iris, a magnificent, luminous flower, whose petals were said to radiate a soft, silver light capable of clearing the dark dynastic plagues from the air of the province. The seeds of the celestial iris were identical, cast from an ancient obsidian-like pod that was handed down once every century. The soil of the terraces was uniform, a rich, dark volcanic ash that had been filtered through mountain springs for 1,000 years. Garrick was a man of intense white-knuckled discipline, a cultivator whose name was whispered with awe in the lowlands because of his unremitting commitment to hardship. He believed that to produce a miracle of such magnitude, the flesh must pay an absolute price in torment. He planted his seed within the central terrace and immediately established an iron regime of monitoring. He constructed complex, mechanical shading apparatuses made of lead and oiled hide, constantly raising and lowering them by hand to adjust the light down to the exact millimeter. Garrick lived in his field. He sat over the soil through the freezing night watches, his jaw locked, his muscles coiled, his stomach knotted with a continuous low-grade fever of worry. Whenever the wind shifted from the north, he would jump to his feet, shouting at his laborers, manually tilling the surface of the soil with an iron fork to ensure the oxygen was optimal. Every afternoon, unable to master the terror of the silent dark beneath the ash, Garrick would take a slender ivory needle and plunge it into the earth, carefully probing the perimeter of the seed to detect if the membrane had swollen. His life was a monument to strategy, friction, and defensive vigilance. He performed his devotion as if he were being graded by an angry deity, view his own exhaustion as the ultimate validation that his crop would succeed. Linnea operated from an entirely different understanding of the mountain. On the morning of the planting, she carried her seed to the southern terrace. She knelt in the soft volcanic ash, her posture relaxed, her breath deep and rhythmic. She placed the obsidian seed into the earth with a gentle, unhurried finality, smoothed the soil over its head with a single stroke of her palm, and stood up. She did not build mechanical shades. She did not stay awake to monitor the wind. She did not plunge needles into the dark to check for roots. Linnea returned to her stone cottage at the edge of the terrace. She spent her days weaving fine white silk on her wooden loom, reading the ancient scrolls of the sages, and walking through the pine forest with a light, unburdened step. When the town elders ran to her garden with knotted stomachs, pointing at the bare, silent dirt of her terrace and crying that Garrick's field was a theater of immense activity, Linnea would merely smile, her eyes reflecting the calm of the high peaks. "Why do you tremble for the iris?" she would say softly, her voice carrying the resonance of an ancient truth. "The architecture of the light is already written into the marrow of the seed. The ash knows its duty, the water understands its path. My anxiety cannot add a single cubit to its growth. I have planted the fact. Now I must honor the seed by resting in the certainty of its harvest." By the third moon, the consequences of the two methods were written into the landscape. In Garrick's terrace, the soil was chaotic, chewed to pieces by his constant tilling and the frantic probing of his ivory needles. When the first green shoots finally appeared, they were pale, twisted, and sickly. The constant friction of his anxiety had poisoned the water channels. His white-knuckled monitoring had disrupted the delicate, involuntary mechanics of germination. Before the flowers could even form, the stalks rotted at the base, dissolving into a gray, sterile mush that smelled of sulfur and fear. His 50 days of agony had produced nothing but a monument to his own bankruptcy. In Linnea's terrace, where the soil had been left in absolute unbothered peace, the earth suddenly split open with an explosive vitality. 100 magnificent emerald stalks shot up toward the sun, thick as a warrior's wrist, unfolding their petals in perfect synchronization. The celestial iris bloomed with a blinding silver luminescence that filled the entire valley with a scent of wild honey and mint. The flowers did not strain to grow. They did not compete for the light. They simply unfolded their glory because they were entirely true to the internal programming that Linnea had trusted from the first morning. The universe had organized their perfection through the simple, majestic gravity of her rest. The victory of the quiet cultivator is the precise architectural manual required by the individual who wishes to step out of the exhausting cycles of forced production. To dissolve the frantic urgency of the spade and allow the law of the harvest to manifest your highest destiny, the individual must implement the practice of the field of non-interference. This is an immediate, daily audit of the source of your actions, designed to separate the labor of the slave from the inspired expression of the master. To embody this truth today, before you execute any task in your life, whether it be the writing of a business message, the undertaking of a creative project, or the management of a physical condition, you must pause your hands and look directly at the radio dial of your underlying state. If you find that the action is being driven by a feeling of emergency, a belief that if you do not act with intensity, your desire will fail to manifest, you must have the immense spiritual courage to drop the tool. You must sit quietly, soften your biology, and deliver an absolute decree to your own analytical intellect. I refuse to dig up my seed with the spade of my panic. I have planted the reality of my fulfillment within the soil of my consciousness, and the law of creation is already maturing its form. I stand back, and I allow my actions to flow as an expression of victory, not a battle for it. When this alignment is secured, the individual steps back into the world moving with an entirely different quality of speed. They no longer work to earn their good. They move because their good is already an ancient inheritance that is naturally unfolding its contours through their days. Their actions become fluid, joyful, and highly effective, characterized by an unhurried grace that leaves the frantic world in a state of absolute wonder. They leave the field of struggle forever, allowing the natural current of their assumption to carry them toward the harvest. But as the individual master this absolute rest within action, as they learn to leave the soil of their consciousness undisturbed under the stars, they find themselves approaching the absolute, final boundary of their spiritual transformation. The seed is growing, the biology is soft, and the actions are aligned. Yet, as they stand on the edge of the golden field, a sudden, freezing wind sweeps down from the high peaks of the world. The external scenery undergoes a sudden, violent distortion. The sky turns the color of ash, the leaves wither on the vine, and the physical senses report a total, catastrophic contradiction to everything they have assumed to be true. The absolute, final test of human mastery has arrived. The lens of our cinematic inquiry must now prepare to leave the peaceful fields of the harvest and ascend to the absolute highest tower of the fortress. For the circumstances are preparing to scream their final, terrifying lies, and the soul must find a way to stand completely unmoved before the storm. We must prepare to cross the final threshold into the absolute, diamond-hard sanctuary of the spirit and enter the magnificent, unbreakable peace known as the sovereign Sabbath. The atmospheric pressure atop the peaks of the jagged redoubts has fallen to a historic, terrifying minimum. Outside the stone buttresses of the ancient citadel, an apocalyptic winter tempest has unleashed its full, unmitigated fury upon the landscape. The wind does not merely blow, it screams with a demonic multitonal resonance, hurling sheets of freezing sleet against the high, narrow window panes with the velocity of shrapnel. The sensory evidence reported by the external world is absolute, violent, and catastrophic. Lightning arches across a bruised, midnight black sky, illuminating a valley of withered fields, snapped pines, and rising floodwaters. To any observer dependent upon the reports of the five senses, the conclusion is non-negotiable. The kingdom is under terminal siege, destruction is imminent, and survival demands immediate, frantic mobilization. Yet, if the cinematic lens glides past the rattling iron frames of the windows, penetrating deep into the heart of the central keep, an incredible, unyielding paradox is encountered. Within the grand hearthroom, where walls of 3-foot-thick granite insulate the interior from the screaming vacuum outside, sits a sovereign ruler. He is bathed in the warm, stable amber glow of a crackling oak fire. His shoulders are dropped in a posture of royal relaxation. His jaw is entirely soft. His breath moves with a slow, deep, and rhythmic cadence, in, out, completely untouched by the frantic vibration of the gale. He does not run to the windows to monitor the storm. He does not pace the slate floor with a knotted stomach. He does not issue panicked commands to his captains to fortify the gates. In his hands, the king holds an ancient sealed parchment scroll. It is a document delivered weeks ago by a royal courier from a distant coast, bearing the immutable red wax signet of the Supreme Command. The text written upon the vellum is brief and definitive. The war is ended. The enemy has surrendered their arms. The territory is secured in perpetuity. The king does not hope that the peace will arrive. He does not visualize a future victory through gritted teeth. He does not perform frantic rituals to appease the thunderclouds. He knows, with a bone-deep, unquestioned certainty, that the storm outside his fortress is not a current creative force. It is merely an atmospheric residue, a chaotic, dying gasp of weather that has already lost its structural premise. The eyes behold a theater of war, but the spirit rests in the finished reality of an absolute peace. The sovereign has entered his Sabbath. To dismantle the final, most hazardous illusion on the path of self-mastery, consciousness must turn its analytical lens upon the nature of sensory contradiction. One must deploy the rigorous method of recursive thinking, boring through the superficial panic of human reaction to ask the foundational questions. Why does the human spirit instinctively collapse into doubt when external circumstances flatly deny their internal assumptions? And how does an individual maintain an immovable psychological rest when the material world reports a catastrophe? The why is rooted in humanity's ancient systematic conditioning to treat the physical world as a primary, living reality. The unawakened mind looks upon its circumstances, the negative bank balance, the medical diagnosis, the empty room, and classifies this data as the absolute truth of the present moment. When an individual attempts to alter the radio dial of their internal state, assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled, they expect the material world to immediately bow its head. If the physical world instead presents an aggressive obstacle, a defensive panic rises within the psyche. The ego screams that the internal assumption was a delusion, that the practice has failed, and that the individual must immediately descend back into the frantic, white-knuckled warfare of striving and manipulation to protect themselves from deletion. How then does the master navigate this moment of sensory treason? They navigate it by understanding the exact relationship between the mirror, the shadow, and the echo. The physical world possesses absolutely zero independent creative power. It is an entirely dense, plastic, and delayed medium. What an individual perceives through their physical eyes in the immediate present is not a live broadcast of current creative forces. It is merely the mechanical projection of past states of consciousness. It is a dying echo, a harmless shadow cast upon the canvas of time by old assumptions, old panics, and old definitions that have already run their course within the internal laboratory. When an individual experiences a contradiction in their environment, they are not looking at a current reality, they are looking at old data. If a man reacts to the old data with a tight stomach and a clenched jaw, he is performing a tragic metaphysical resurrection. His reaction of fear is a fresh, powerful decree to the mirror that lack and hostility are the dominant truths of his existence. The mirror, bound by its own mechanical nature, has no choice but to take that reactive frequency and perpetuate the crisis, projecting it further out into the timeline of his tomorrow. To enter the sovereign Sabbath is to execute a total psychological divorce from the authority of appearances. The Sabbath is not a day of the week, it is a permanent, majestic state of consciousness. It is the holy rest that follows the absolute completion of an internal shift. It is the state of mind that looks upon the finished reality of the assumption and pronounces, "It is done, it is finished, it is good." Within this state of rest, the individual undergoes a radical redefinition of their desires. They realize a truth that the world has spent centuries trying to obscure. Humanity is not here to earn its good. Desires are not prizes distributed by a withholding celestial authority to the most disciplined or suffering laborers. Desires are revelations. They are intimate, precise signs of an inheritance that already exists in its completeness within the infinite field of consciousness. The moment a desire arises in the heart, it is not a wish for something that might happen. It is the announcement of a reality that is already calling the individual's name from the end of the timeline. The role of the individual is not to create the fulfillment through the agony of their muscles or the white-knuckled intensity of their techniques. Their only role is to claim it. Claiming does not look like pursuit. It looks like acceptance. It is the quiet, settled, and almost boring certainty of an individual who has accepted a fact so deeply that they no longer require a single molecule of external proof to validate its existence. They turn the internal radio dial to the exact frequency of completion, lock the mechanism in place, and allow the external world to exhaust its old echoes against the stone walls of their absolute silence. In the central provinces of the old empire, during an era when the decrees of the throne were carried by standard bearers across vast territories of forest and mountain, there ruled a young monarch named King Alistair. His realm had been plagued for a decade by a bitter subterranean border, war with the warlords of the outer wastes, a conflict that had drained the treasuries, exhausted the harvests, and kept the citizenry in a state of perpetual, low-grade terror. On the eve of the spring equinox, after months of silent, unseen negotiations conducted by secret envoys in the neutral valleys, a historic pact was finalized. The warlords of the Waste signed the Great Edict of Submission, surrendering their fortresses, dissolving their armies, and swearing absolute, unalterable fealty to the crown. The treaty was absolute. The war was legally, historically, and structurally ended. The document, signed in the blood of the chieftains and stamped with the imperial seal, was laid upon King Alistair's walnut desk. The king read the scroll, breathed a deep, resonant sigh of release, and entered his Sabbath. He ordered his servants to extinguish the watchfires on the battlements, to store the heavy iron siege weapons in the deep vaults, and to prepare a grand festival of thanksgiving for the province. He sat by his high window, watching the sunset over the western hills with a posture of complete, unhurried ease. 2 days later, while the kingdom was still sleeping in the early hours before dawn, the heavy oak doors of the council chamber were violently thrown open. A provincial messenger burst into the room, his clothes torn, his face pale with panic, his body drenched in the cold sweat of a frantic ride. He fell to his knees before the throne, wringing his hands, his breath escaping his lips in ragged, terrified gasps. "Your Majesty!" the messenger screamed, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling like a stone shattering glass. "You must mobilize the guard. You must fortify the western walls immediately. I have just ridden from the border outposts. The horizon is filled with smoke. I saw 30 war wagons moving through the mountain passes. I heard the clanking of iron spears in the dark. The outriders are shouting that the warlords are marching to burn our fields. We are being invaded. If you do not draw your sword today, the kingdom will be erased by nightfall." The counselors of the realm jumped to their feet, their faces turning gray with an immediate infectious terror. They began to shout at one another, wringing their hands, frantically calculating how many soldiers could be raised from the fields before the sun reached its zenith. They looked at King Alistair, demanding that he assume the posture of a wartime commander, that he clench his jaw, grit his teeth, and join them in their panic. King Alistair did not move from his seat. He did not rise. He did not reach for his ceremonial blade. His shoulders did not tighten by a single millimeter. He looked down upon the screaming messenger with a look of profound, serene, and unblinking pity. Slowly, without a single trace of hurry, the king reached into the silk sleeve of his robe and pulled out the great edict of submission. He laid the parchment flat upon the stone table before his counselors, his finger resting calmly upon the dark red wax of the imperial seal. "Calm your breath, young man," Alistair said softly, his voice carrying the deep, immovable stability of bedrock. "The invasion you speak of is an illusion." "But your Majesty," the messenger wept, pointing a trembling hand toward the western windows. "I saw the smoke with my own eyes. I heard the iron spears. I am not reporting a dream. I am reporting the physical facts of the border." "You are reporting old data, my friend," the king replied with a quiet, unbothered authority. "The warlords signed their total submission 2 days ago. The war is legally finished. What you saw in the mountain passes is not an advancing army. It is the retreat of a broken force, moving back to their valleys to dismantle their wagons. The smoke you saw is the burning of their old defensive camps. The spears you heard are being stacked for the forge. You ran from the border in such a state of panic that you outran the news of my decree. You are fighting the shadow of an enemy that has already surrendered. I will not break the peace of my Sabbath to fight a war that has already been won in the ledger of the empire." The king refused to issue a single mobilization order. He left his swords in the armory. He kept his watch. Fires dark, he allowed his citizens to continue their preparations for the festival. 3 days later, another rider arrived from the west, not with a scream of panic, but with a crown of white lilies. He confirmed exactly what the king had known from the beginning. The border was silent, the warlords had laid down their armor, and the smoke was indeed the destruction of the old war camps. The kingdom had been saved, not because the king had run to the walls to fight the reflection, but because he had possessed the immense sovereign courage to remain unmoved in the absolute certainty of his decree. The triumph of King Alistair is the final definitive blueprint required by every individual who stands upon the absolute threshold of their spiritual transformation. The physical world will scream its final lies. The circumstances will present their most aggressive contradictions. The old conditioning of the mind will outrun the news of your internal shift to report a crisis. To dissolve the final resistance of the material screen and enter the permanent sanctuary of fulfillment, the individual must implement the practice of the immutable Sabbath. To embody this truth in the immediate present, whenever you are confronted by a piece of external evidence that flatly denies the reality of your wish fulfilled, whether it be an unexpected delay, an apparent loss, or the silence of a landscape you have claimed in consciousness, you must refuse to drop into the defensive posture of the fighter. You must recognize that the crisis is merely the panicked messenger running from the border, carrying the old data of a war that has already been executed within the vault of your spirit. In that moment of confrontation, you must withdraw your attention entirely from the external screen of life. You must anchor your physical vessel into absolute, relaxed immobility, soften your jaw, drop your shoulders, and ask your own consciousness the singular, devastating question that unlocks the kingdom of grace. How would I feel right now if I simply knew, beyond any possibility of doubt, that what I desire is already an accomplished, historical fact within my world? You sit with that question not to manufacture a feeling through effort, but to allow the actual, felt sense of a finished case to settle into your bones. It is the ordinary, quiet, and almost boring certainty of an individual who knows their own name or who knows what city they currently inhabit. When that somatic anchor is located, you step back into your day, not as someone trying to achieve a result, but as someone who is executing an inheritance that has already cleared the courts. Let the feeling of "it is done" become the very atmosphere you move through, the quiet background radiation of every word you speak, every step you take, and every breath you draw. Let it slow your walk, deepen your voice, and quiet the urgency in your eyes. You no longer look at the state. You look from the state. You have ceased to perform your faith as an exam for an imaginary auditor. You have closed the ledgers of struggle forever. The 1-0 chapter journey of consciousness has reached its absolute cinematic completion. The architecture of surrender is stable. The myth of the cosmic employer has been dissolved. The blueprint of absence has been collapsed into the stillness of the abyss. The unseen conception has been guarded from the mud. The cult of hardship has been abandoned. The biological template has been chemically altered. The bridge of incidence has been set into motion. And the soil of the invisible harvest has been left in absolute peace. The traveler has returned to the quiet room from which they first closed their eyes, but they return transformed. They are no longer a hunter chasing a retreating horizon across a desert of lack. They are a sovereign ruler sitting by an unyielding fire, completely insulated from the storms of appearances, resting in the absolute, beautiful, and eternal knowledge that consciousness is the only reality there is, and everything else is merely the echo catching up. The ledger is closed. The current is moving. The work of creation is complete. It is done. Rest in that.